Gentlemen, this is Thursday, January 30, and this is the school committee meeting of that date. And I'd like to start the meeting. I want to say that Mr. David Pollock, one of us, is absent this evening. He's receiving an award tonight from the Boston Society of Architects. And he's receiving that award in connection with projects that he's done. The award is in 3 categories: education facilities, socially responsible housing, and excellence in accessible design. So we're very proud of him, and he's been a great addition for that and many other reasons to this committee. I would draw your attention to the calendar, which is up on the screen. It outlines both the school committee meetings for February and the override study committee meetings that are scheduled, and also the school subcommittee meetings. And we'll expect all of you at all of them. We have a consent agenda, and if anyone is so inclined, I'd welcome a motion for that consent agenda. Okay, thanks. Ms. Stone has moved. Do I have a second, please? Oh, thank you very much, Ms. Scotto. Appreciate that very much.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
May I ask a question?
You may, Ms. Stone.
Can you, I note that we're talking about the Runkle school trip, which we've approved before, but can you tell us what the Peter James Scholarship is, please?
Yes, I can. There is a gentleman by the name of, and Ms. Coyne, you can help me with this, by the name of Peter James, who died, I think, while he was in the high school. And he's a graduate. And I'll read you what it says. Peter passed away in 2007 due to complications from cystic fibrosis. In the years since, his family and friends have raised money for a number of causes in his memory, largely to fund research for a cure to cystic fibrosis. This year, we wanted to create this scholarship in order to give back to the community that shaped him as a person and as a student. It is our hope that we can assist the Brookline High School graduate who has overcome a personal hardship in pursuing a college education.
May I?
Yes, please,
Peter
Dr. Lubin.
is also the son of Kirk James, who was a long-time terrific guidance counselor at Devotion School. I'm not sure if Kirk worked other places, but I know Kirk from his work at Devotion School, where he just did amazing work for us, and he's a terrific person.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. So I presume that we still thank the donors for this very generous recognition.
We write a letter.
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
You're very welcome. There being no other questions, can I ask for those in favor of the consent agenda to raise their hands, please? Those opposed? Those abstaining? Ms. Kershaw has not had enough time to examine.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't at the legislative breakfast or the last school.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
that's part of the part of the past
otherwise
record.
I would obviously
Absolutely,
have supported the Runkle
right.
trip and the Pete James.
Okay, great. Okay, so the ayes have it, and we can proceed. Ms. Kershaw, I think we're going to do the Finance Committee report when we get to the presentation on the second quarter report. And so we'll wait until then, and I think Mr. Rowe is going to help us with that at that time. So Ms. Charlupski, we're at capital improvements.
Right, and I think, Dr. Lupini, are you going to be talking about the short-term, long-term facilities plan?
Certainly can.
Okay,
Would you like me to do that?
I think so.
Thank you.
Since we're going to be having a hearing about it at next Thursday, February 6th, at 6 o'clock. A hearing about the Old Lincoln Transition Plan, not the long-term facilities plan.
Give me 1 second, okay?
Okay.
While we're waiting, we do have under capital improvements,
Well, I think we should wait for the vote. We could do the.
the old Lincoln. How about the old Lincoln?
I got it. Thank you.
Yes, no, I think we should wait to hear the plan and then do the vote.
Very good.
I think that makes sense.
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
On February 6th, there's a capital subcommittee meeting set as a public hearing on, and we've tried to be really clear on this. So we've distributed a set of recommendations and then a set of options. And while I'm sure we may hear from some people on some of the options, the public hearing is actually on the recommendations. And the recommendations deal with the old Lincoln School, the use of it as transition space for our elementary projects. I did have a chance to speak with Devotion parents because that's the specifics of the recommendations right now deal with Devotion and Devotion School. I had a chance to speak with parents as a sort of add-on to the session that the architects conducted with parents. Was that this week? Earlier this
It
week?
was just Monday, yes.
Yeah, earlier this week. The specific recommendations here then are to designate the old Lincoln School as transition elementary school space for the 15-16 school year through the 17-18 school year. To designate the building as some use in the grade span of 6 through 8 school during that time. Include Devotion students as part of the transition school. You have an action item recommended by the subcommittee, thank you very much, to permit the administration to hire a principal for this school on or before April 14, to begin on July 1st of 14, and then to direct the administration to formulate specific proposals for the use of Old Lincoln School by Brookline High School on or before January 15 for when they assume use of the building following its use of these for elementary. I will say, so this talks specifically about in 15-16 moving grades 6, 7, 8 from Devotion. We have continued to explore options off of that recommendation. For example, one of the options that we're exploring, I believe in response to parents and concerns that were raised, is the idea of not moving the 6th grade until the 2nd and 3rd year. There's a couple reasons to explore that. The first really is that our construction project actually doesn't begin in 15-16. And we don't need that number of classrooms out. We will run out of space during that year, but we don't need all 3 of those grade levels out. So the issue, of course, that we're exploring, and I'll get some recommendations from the administration at the school and our special educators tomorrow, deals with district-wide programs and breaking the continuity of those district-wide programs and how that works in terms of numbers of students in each grade. Just in terms of the preliminary data I've heard, Principal Flewelling and Mr. Knock, Mark Knock, who's the special education administrator in that building, have just done marvelous work of really analyzing those numbers so that I have some things where I could modify the recommendation to better meet some parental concerns. We've also talked with parents in those sessions, so that you know, about forming a parental advisory committee in terms of them providing input to the entire process. We've talked with them about details of how we've done transportation, how we've set transportation up in other projects, and a number of things in terms of what programming may look like and what we may be able to provide there. So I think, and I think some people may have been there, it was a great conversation.
No, it was more than a great conversation. I thought the parents asked very good questions, and I think that Dr. Lupini answered them all quite well. I think some of them were more difficult or were more they weren't questions, they were statements that were difficult to answer. But all in all, I think that parents went away with a clear sense of what it is we're thinking, why we're thinking it, and how we hope to accomplish it. And so I think that, in addition to the architects, just sort of veer off a little bit, presentation and their hopes and desires for the new building, were, I think, altogether quite a successful evening for the Devotion School. And you may know more about the
I just feel very sorry because I had to leave early, so I missed that portion of the conversation. But I do know that there has been a real appreciation of your willingness to converse about it and to listen to the concerns. So, and I imagine that will continue with the public hearing.
Absolutely. Let me just say one other word about those two sessions, the community session and then the parent session, and just here to applaud the work of Jennifer Flewelling and Tam Sitkoff, who is working with us on helping us look at smaller school environments in this project, and will also in the high school project. But in particular, and I know Ms. Charlevsky commented to the principal, thank you very much for sending that note along, to the facilitation of those sessions was just terrific.
Yeah.
The way they were organized, the way people worked in groups around their hopes and dreams and concerns for the building, both evenings gave the architects really amazing feedback. And they were just well facilitated by the principal, who did a terrific job of working with her community and her parents on both of those evenings. Thanks.
You're welcome. So thank you for that. So that's our short-term plan. Right now, I think we'll leave the long-term plan for a little further down. We do know that Devotion is moving ahead, and we hope to have a statement of interest draft possibly at the next capital subcommittee for the Driscoll School. I spoke with Peter about that as hopefully something that's doable for our meeting in February, the end of February. Yes.
Can I just say one thing on the Old Lincoln?
Yes.
So there seems to be a group of, I'm not sure how large the group is, a couple people in town who I think it would be helpful to hear them, for us to say yet again that this is not a stepping stone towards creating a long-term junior high school in Brookline, that the superintendent, I think, the school committee is committed to a K-8 structure, that we're committed to non-permanent use of the Old Lincoln School. All those words are in there, but for whatever reason, people weren't completely reading them. I think that, so I think what I tried to explain is that we're trying to balance two priorities. One is that we still believe in the K-8 system. We still believe that this is a non-permanent use. We still believe that Old Lincoln is going to be needed for other purposes, and we can I can come up with at least 3 claims on the Old Lincoln space at the end of this time. So we're trying to explain that, but at the same time say we're trying to create a school. We're trying to hire a principal. We want them to have a culture. We want to do improvement. So I think it's very important that we be as clear as possible that we're trying to walk that very fine line in the long-term commitment, which has not changed. But in the near term, we feel as worried that a group of students feel like they are in a building with a culture and with meaning for those 3 years, as we are equally committed that at the end of those 3 years, yes, in fact, that principal knows, whomever that person will be, knows that this is a 3-year commitment and it's not a permanent junior high school. So if you all are, I've been hearing a lot of that in the last few days, and others might be hearing it also.
I think that was very clearly talked about at the meeting,
Okay.
certainly. So
But there are other
hopefully
people who-
Devotion parents
but-
now understand that.
Right, all I'm saying is there are other parents
Right.
and other
Absolutely.
community members who aren't.
Hopefully the tab will help us with some of this.
If you can help us with that, that would be terrific. It's really important for people to understand that.
So let me say something to that, and that sort of bifurcates these two sets of issues. I have been asked, about concerns about one of the options being Driscoll and one of the options being Pierce. I have talked to both of those principals, as well as Rick Rogers, because that's in there as an option as well, about really dealing with the options after we get through the first part of this public hearing. So if there's going to be a discussion with parents or whatever, it would occur after we've done that piece. I think we take a number of those things off the table in those meetings. And it could be that some of those options are no longer options by that time. I mean, you recall in the discussion that morning that we have things to consider about those options as we go along, and that certain things might break in a way that would take one of those options off the table by then, and we may begin to narrow the options. Certainly, we want to narrow the options to one by the end of the year.
The end of which year?
End of this school year. So that's one piece. The second piece is I neglected to say, I neglected to say that if tomorrow in that meeting, or by Monday, we're able to modify this recommendation slightly, we will make sure people are aware of that long before Thursday. Absolutely. I don't want people coming to a public hearing thinking they're coming to speak on this, and we've modified the recommendation to this. So we'll get that out Monday or so that impacted people would see that we've actually changed the recommendation, if indeed that's where we end up, and I'm hopeful.
Okay, that sounds very good, actually. Thank you.
Can I just add to that,
Sure.
Ms. Charlevsky, for a moment?
Yes?
Okay, so if I'm not, I've heard or seen some concern that people think that there's going to be a high school class placed at Old Lincoln School, which is one of the concerns about extending a student's stay there. And I heard you say something else about that, which I think is important.
So I think I should tape all of these sessions, right, in one way or another, because both in the session here with the Capital Subcommittee and in the devotion meeting, I've tried to be quite clear that the Old Lincoln School, when we recommend options for the high school, one of them will not be that the Old Lincoln School will be a 9th grade campus, because the number of students there in the year that we see ourselves starting that particular project wouldn't fit. So we need to look at specific programs within the high school or classes or departments. Those will be the options we'll be considering, not a particular grade level.
That's precisely what I had in mind. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the committee about the plan? I think you've all had a chance to see it. Bill had sent it around, and you'll send around any other revisions that might happen to the school committee, as you usually do. I guess at this point, I would like to propose a vote to allow the superintendent. We did discuss this at the Capital Subcommittee and felt very strongly that it was important to begin the process of hiring a principal for the Old Lincoln School so that that person could hit the ground running in July and work with the architect, hopefully even before. Actually, as an aside to this piece, I spoke with Tony today, and he says he's almost done with putting together the contract for the architectural firm, so that project should be getting going quite soon in terms of the design, getting in the input and the some of the design elements together. So I guess what I'd like to do is propose that we vote to allow the superintendent to hire a principal for the Old Lincoln School effective July 1st, 2014. And I assume the monies for that particular hire would be in the budget
You will see them tonight.
2015. Perfect. Okay.
So we need a second for that. Go ahead.
Yeah,
No, no, I'll do it after you do
Right,
that.
right.
So,
I'll second.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cox. We have a second. Now, Ms. Ditkoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any use to saying that it's for a 3-year appointment, or do we want to leave it open-ended?
It's
4-year, sorry. Like, would that unduly create a problem later, or
It could.
are we, all right,
It could.
all right, fine.
I don't think you would negotiate a contract beyond
Absolutely not.
3 years, because that's our normal.
Well,
The
but
parameters on this are 4.
So,
This is a 4-year school
Right,
project.
Right.
1 year of planning, 3 years in the school. If we need to extend that, I hope we don't, we would deal with that later, but it will be a 4.
right, but my question is, should that be in the vote or no?
I don't think it needs to be.
Okay, as long as that's the, okay,
That's what
that's fine.
we're going to deal with in
Fine.
terms of.
I think it's in the record anyways.
It's in the record, fine, okay.
Are there other, yes, Ms. Cox?
And then, sorry, just before the vote, I don't know if Dr. Lupino, you could talk a little bit about what is the process for hiring that principal? How does that work in this instance?
So we've done, to this point, we've done an internal posting. We know we have people from among our administrative team who will be interested. I'll be quite candid and say there are people from among that administrative team who we think are a great fit for what we're looking at in terms of this particular school. I do believe there will be more than one. And at that point, we'll figure out some form of a modified interview process for them, probably involving a principal or two, certainly members of the senior staff. It's a little bit more difficult in this instance, in a first round or whatever, to involve people beyond that. I mean, I was reminded that when the district has done this before in terms of the 9th grade campus and those kinds of things, it's been a simple appointment. We do view going slightly beyond that in terms of process, particularly given that we'll have multiple candidates. But again, I'll be very open and say we believe we have the principal from within that internal posting. If that turns out not to be the case, then we might need to go outside and make it a little bit more formal process.
Yes, Ms. Scudder.
Will there be any interaction between the principals of the schools where the students come from and this principal? And I'm thinking about things like graduation. So an 8th grade class graduates that might be a combination of, I don't know, Driscoll and Devotion students. Are they graduating from this interim school, or are they graduating from their own school? How is that going to
Right. So Ms. Charlepsky's was at this session the other night, and if she counted, I think she probably would have counted at least 12 to 15 things that I put on the job description of this particular principal during the transition time in terms of the kinds of relationships and planning that need to take place. Everything from meeting with students to regular meetings with parents to the formation of this advisory committee to working with the architect to figuring those issues out with our principals of, if it's 2 schools, and me. Because to the point that was raised earlier, we're going to try to pull off something that's a little bit more than a little bit tricky here, right? We want to have a school with an identity, and we want to have some identity with the elementary school that the students have come from, right? And what we have, the great advantage that we have in front of us is we have time, something we don't often do very well. But we have time. We have this year of this person in planning with the 2 principals, if it's from 2 schools, to actually talk about what those kinds of things might look like. And my commitment to you is to come back to you and the parents at some point during the year with a plan as to how we're proposing to do those things.
Ms. Stone.
I just want to say that because we spend a lot of time talking about, in the context of our schools growing larger, about the importance of creating community, of having spaces where students feel that they belong, that they and that they're safe and known. So I think this approach that we're taking to the use of Old Lincoln School is exactly in keeping with that value, that we are working very hard, and I just want to commend you. I think that that's exactly the right approach, that we are creating a community because that's the most important thing for our students, for their learning, and that putting that priority on the table and not just saying, well, we're going to use Old Lincoln because it's there, but saying, no, we have to create a community for these kids because it's an important 3 years, and they deserve to have the best they can have. So anyway, just want to say that that's the focus, as I see it, that's really the focus of what we're doing here. So I think it's the right approach.
Thank you.
Ms. Cox.
I just want to echo that sentiment. I think it's very encouraging that we have this time, that we're spending a year thinking about the vision of creating a school that students will fruitfully spend their time in on their way to something else. And there's the loss of having to move from the school that they've been in, but there's also the opportunity of being involved in something that will have its own culture, as well as retaining their identity. And I'm very excited about what that might end up looking like in the short term.
Thanks.
Ms. Kershaw.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Morris. I just want to echo that too, because I feel like it's going to be very challenging for the families who are affected by this. They're going to be uprooted from their experience and expectations of being part of the K-8 school in which they entered, and the students are going to get moved, and for the other schools that might be affected too. And I think people are going to be very anxious about that. But I feel very optimistic that we're going to create a really interesting program for middle schoolers, and I think it's something that we have an opportunity to do. I love the K-8 model, and I think, but one of the things about the K-8 model is you don't get to do really specific middle school programming that focuses on their developmental stage and what supports them educationally. And I think we're doing a great job of that throughout the district, but I think this gives us a real opportunity to focus on this age group for those years. So I think it will be very difficult for the families who are affected by it, but I also think there's going to be a big benefit to them because I know we're going to do the programming right, and I think we want to focus on both of those aspects of it, recognizing how hard it'll be for the families that are affected and how committed we are to making it a really good, interesting, special experience for the families who end up there. So.
Okay, I think, unless there's more conversation, I think we can vote this. Do you want me to do it?
No, I'll be glad to do it.
Okay.
Thanks. So, it was good conversation, and now I would ask for those people who are in favor of allowing the superintendent to hire a principal for the Old Lincoln School to raise their hands, please. All those opposed? All those abstaining? You have a unanimous vote, Dr. Lupini.
So the next item that we have is a vote to amend the contract with Temple Emmett. As those of you will remember, we do have a contract with Temple Emmett. This is a vote to amend the contract for more space, and we did discuss it in Capital Subcommittee. If people feel the need, we can have Mr. Rowe talk a little bit more about this, but I think we did talk quite a bit about this contract. It's here once we voted for people to sign. Are there any questions that people might have? Yes, Ms. Stone.
I just think it's important to clarify that this is for pre-K
Oh, thank you.
classrooms.
Yes, this is
And
for
and some
extension of
and some
piece.
administrative, right?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
primarily those support teachers that
Right.
that will work at the with the students in the classrooms, but in some ways it's their home base. Yes, so we'll be able to locate some of the staff that currently has their office desk, if you will, at the high school, move them out to the space at Temple Emmett.
Right,
as
again,
well as the
so it's
classrooms.
just to piggyback on what I said about the Old Lincoln School, that this is enabling us to have a more community-like approach to the programs that are being off-sited to Temple Emmett.
That's correct, yes.
Any other questions or comments? Can I get a motion? I'll make the motion to amend the contract with Temple Emmett, to approve the amendment to the contract with Temple Emmett.
We have a second? Very good.
All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, and please remember to sign.
Thank you all.
Well done.
One other, I'm not done. Yes?
Just one other note on that. Mr. Rowe gave a quick summary of this to the Override Study Committee, Capital Subcommittee, so there shouldn't be any surprises here, that this was something that was under consideration.
Right, we had, when we initially discussed this, the contract to rent spaces in the beginning, there was this option that we knew about, and we've taken advantage of that option, basically.
Yes, I just think it's important for people to understand that these processes are happening in parallel, but the linkages are getting made at every opportunity. So thank you, Mr. Rowe, for being the link.
One other piece, the Devotion School Building Committee will be meeting on February 7th. So that's our next meeting for that group. And does anybody else have anything else from our Capital Subcommittee? I know I'm missing something, but right now I'm blanking. Okay, I reserve the right to maybe come up with it later. Thank you.
Very good. Ms. Scotto, are we on curriculum?
Well, we have a lot to report tonight.
Very good.
This past Tuesday, we had a curriculum subcommittee meeting that focused on the high school course catalog changes. And just as a little bit of background, people should know that when every year new courses are proposed, and this comes about through a number of things. Sometimes they discover that a new course is needed in a particular area. Sometimes teachers express interest in teaching a new course, and at other times, teachers start talking to one another and decide they would like to collaborate on a course. When a course is proposed, the teacher develops the course. It then gets presented at a department meeting for feedback, and all of the people in the department give a great deal of feedback about the course. Person goes back and revises it, and then it is taken to the Academic Standards Committee. And the Academic Standards Committee consists of many people: the headmaster, the assistant headmaster, the guidance coordinator, the department chairs, and 2 of the deans. And these people again look at the course and decide what they think about it, and they may propose other revision. And once this has undergone all of this discussion and revision, it comes to the capital subcommittee and eventually to the curriculum subcommittee and eventually to the school committee. This year there are 3 new courses proposed. The first of these is an African, Latin American, and hip-hop dance course. This is a course that will replace another course that was a course in international and social dancing. The students signing up for this course have declined in the past 3 years, and so I think that the department is looking to get something that's a little bit more relevant to students today. And there's a great deal of interest on the part of the students in this course. A course that focuses in part on hip-hop will appeal more to the boys at the high school as well as the girls, so they're hoping to increase that group of students. And it's a multi-level course, so you can come in with a bit of experience or no experience at all, and you can take this for more than 1 semester. There already is a hip-hop dance group at the high school, and there are lots of students who observe what's happening there, and some even dance with the hip-hop group. So they think that by adding this group, this course, it will be very popular and serve a need and work as a way for students to get a taste of some of the dance offerings and perhaps expand even beyond this in their coursework. The second course is a course called Communications for Entrepreneurs, and it's a senior level course. And it grew out of a collaboration of teachers who began talking on lunch duty.
No, that was the other.
Wasn't that one?
I think they met at the 21st Century Fund's Innovation Summit.
Yes. Ah, that's absolutely right. Excuse me, I was on by telephone, so, who knows. Anyway, okay, so they met, but they did meet and they talked about it through the 21st Century Fund. And this particular course is a course that will focus on public speaking, reading, and writing for students, but will focus on their being entrepreneurs. It's very interesting because they have a public speaking course, but it's pretty diffuse, and that will still be offered. This will be just a bit more focused, so that students will work with, people in the community. They will develop their own projects and will present them in public speaking. They will do a good bit of reading through things like Harvard Business Review and other scholarly articles. They'll read books by people like Guy Kawasaki and Malcolm Gladwell. It sounds like it is very interesting, and it will be a course that is offered through the English department, but will also appeal to kids who are in technical courses. So that's the second one. The third course is a film as history course. This course has budget implications because it's a new course. And it will be looking at questions about history and how filmmakers look at history, how writers look at history, how historians look at history. And it will take a series of films and develop the program through looking at these films, discussing at these films, reading what historians have written, looking at the film, discussing all of that. And it will be a senior, am I right in that senior level course? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a senior elective, but it will be offered through the history department and the visual arts. So those are the 3 courses. Questions? Helen?
Ms. Chalupsky.
So on 2 of those courses where they're interdisciplinary, is the plan to have 2 teachers or 1 teacher in the course?
I am not sure. Dr. Fisher-Mueller, do you know?
If they get 40 students, they will do 2.
So it depends on the amount of students
Depends on
who
the
sign up
enrollment.
will determine how many teachers. Okay. But, the expertise of the pair is what's important, I think, in some of this.
Right.
So that may be.
So for example, the visual arts and the history.
Right, right.
So it may be that people are sharing the teaching in 2 sections. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
They said that during the presentation of the course at the Academic Standards Committee, the director of the 21st Century Fund was also there at that presentation and was interested, and so that's a possible.
Yeah, I think I was at actually
source
a
of
program
collaboration.
committee meeting where the first one, the entrepreneurial one, was talked about, and that they were interested possibly in supporting that somehow. So.
I actually wanted to ask a little bit about that. You mentioned the 21st Century Fund for 2 of them, but these are not proposals by the 21st Century Fund. These are courses that the high school wants to offer. The 21st Century Fund may or may not participate in. Okay.
There's only one that's 21st Century Fund.
Okay. You said that only one of them had budget implications because it was a new course, but they're all new courses. So what does that mean?
Well, the Communications for Entrepreneurs is, I gather there's more than 1 section for public speaking, the public speaking course in the senior year. So they would be, instead of one course, they would be offering 2 courses, but probably only, in other words, if there were 4 sections of public speaking, 2 of them would be public speaking, 2 of them would be this course.
Okay.
So you don't have any, you don't need to add extra teachers, you are just changing the shift.
So I'm curious in the larger question of the budget implications of approving these.
The budget implications at the meeting, the headmaster said there were only budget implications for the Film as History course because that is a new course.
I think she also talked about the loading of the course.
Dr. Fisher-Mueller, could you
Shed some light.
Yes,
light.
the reason that there are not budget implications for the other 2 is that there won't be an overall increase in the number of sections of courses taught across that greater area. All right, there might be a reduction. Whereas with the film, history is film, film is history, that is an additional section, an additional.
So what are, in the other 2 courses, they're replacing courses that are not going to be offered? Is that?
No, not necessarily courses, but a section of.
Okay, so
something.
we're going to be limiting enrollment in some dance program in order to be
No.
able to offer that?
Right, not
Sorry
limiting.
to be so dense here.
No, you're not being dense. What it is the phrase has been used before that students vote with their feet. Okay, and so the idea being that depending on the numbers of how students fall across these courses, if there are only 8 students signed up in this particular course and there are 20 in this course sort of thing, then that 8-student course would not run.
Right.
Or that section of that class would not run.
Right.
Okay, so in 2 of these 3 courses, while the course is new, if you look at the number of sections of classes taught of all of the courses that are offered, that full number of sections will not change.
So something has to go.
It's not necessarily that a whole course would go. It's that a section of a course. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Clearly,
it's not, when you say limited, it's, I'm thinking of that word as a very active word, the act of limiting. It wouldn't be, it would be depending on the distribution and the decisions made about a particular section not running if it didn't have enough students.
In the dance class, it's a replacement.
It's a replacement.
Okay.
Right.
In the entrepreneurship course, Deb Holman talked about the loading of the course and her feeling that the entrepreneurship course was probably going to be able to fill at the numbers that would be required to keep it within its budget numbers. That with the history of film history as film as history, that was less certain.
So where does that increase get absorbed?
That's up to the magic of the headmaster and how she allocates the FTEs.
Right, so two things, if I might. So on that particular point, there is an increase in staffing at the high school associated with this first year of growing enrollment. And to Dr. Fisher-Mueller's point, that is up to the headmaster to utilize the FTEs that she has in each department to make that work. Where it sort of, goes along with the other issue. I mean, some of the recommendations around dance courses and all are really an attempt to better maximize the utilization of staffing in those courses. Numbers were small. We've said this to you. We made some decisions this year to run some of those sections at smaller numbers because of late enrollments, because of late drops, whatever, knowing that we were going to make some changes to better utilize the number of seats in those courses this year. Those are the recommendations you're seeing there. But this has often been the case that there's an X amount of FTE available, and the headmaster makes choices based on what courses students wish to take.
Right, no, I understand that. I just want to make sure that we're not being asked to increase FTEs in order to offer these courses.
As with a number of other things that we've discussed, and I will discuss tomorrow again with the headmaster, there are, within that, I think it's 5.2 FTE that we had put in that original plan that are in this budget. She needs to make some decisions on priorities within courses and some other pieces. This is one of them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, should I move on to the next item?
If there are no other questions, I would suggest you do.
All right, we had a curriculum meeting, subcommittee meeting before this meeting, and it was one of our school improvement plan meetings. Vanessa Beauchesne from Runkle came to talk about their school improvement goal of improving their math achievement. And she talked about the literacy work that's being done, where we have leveled literacy intervention based on the benchmark assessments, and the fact that in math they were trying to do the same thing at Runkle. There were beginning of the year assessments, but they were finding other assessments that they could use to really identify the students who were in need of math improvement throughout the grades. And we're looking as well to increase their MCAS scores in math. The math specialist was doing a lot of co-teaching, which would ultimately improve classroom teachers' ability to teach to a wide range of students. And they were also doing some short-term interventions with students as well. The sixth grade teacher, Syed Ola, is an intern there, and he has been working particularly on this and he's a sixth grade teacher, so he's the one who was working with the upper grade students. She said that she felt that what was working well is that they were in the process of setting up a math team that would mirror the literacy team. And this is a team that looks at programs in the school and looks over time to see what is working, what isn't working, whether various additions need to be made or not. And so a lot of what is happening is based on what they are assessing as working well. One thing that has really been working well is the use of replacement or supplemental units by Marilyn Burns, which uses literature, for example, as part of teaching math. There is a lot of ongoing monitoring going on, and interventions are based on pretests, and it's working very well. I'm sorry, I'm still a little.
You're in Philadelphia.
I'm still in Philadelphia, what can I say? Not back yet. In any event, it sounded as if it was very exciting, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the future. Rick Rogers at Lawrence talked about the Literacy Collaborative and the work that is being done there in literacy. And he, if I could find my notes, I could tell you even better. He talked about the fact that they were focusing on grades 3 to 5. And this was different from other schools. The other schools were largely focusing on K to 2 at the outset. But they had decided to focus on 3 to 5, and they are implementing a program of reading and writing workshops that has a fairly set format. And they are being heavily helped by the literacy coaches that have been trained at Lesley. The part of the framework is that there are focused, connected mini lessons, there's independent and guided reading, end of class share, and a lot of it has to do with the school culture of continuous improvement and collaboration. In any event, it's working very well, and I think they're very pleased with it. Monica Crowley, the vice principal, talked about the grades 6 to 8, where the teachers are working, again, to develop a consistent approach in all classes and looking at the same workshop model. They have set up month-long units. For example, in October in 7th grade, the reading workshop is looking at short stories. In November, there's a writing workshop on writing short stories, and so forth and so on. And this has been true in 6, 7, and 8. And they feel that there's been a great deal of evidence of success because the students are very motivated to read. They're doing a lot of recommending books to one another. There have been pre- and post-assessments on the various subjects that they're teaching, and kids are doing well. So it sounds as if it is a successful program, and a program in which most of the teachers in the school are involved, and I think they felt that everything was going well. One thing they did say was that we needed to make sure that there was funding for ongoing professional development for the coaches, and I think most of us agreed with that. Anyway, that is what I have to report, except that we have 2 upcoming meetings. On February 25th at 10:30 we will be meeting. The agenda has not yet been set, and on February 27th we will have 2 more school improvement presentations. And that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Gatto. Are there any questions?
I truly hope not, because I'm not sure I'm coherent.
Wonderful. Okay. Ms. Stone, anything on government relations?
I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., and that is the extent of my report.
Brilliant. Brilliant report. And anything on policy review, Ms. Stone?
I'm going to assume that you're skipping negotiations, not for any particular reason.
Oh, I always do that for some reason, right. Anything on negotiations?
But I have nothing further to report
Very
from last
good.
time on negotiations.
Very good.
And, oh, look, policy review. So tonight we will be doing the second reading and vote on the proposed changes to the student residency in intersected properties. Student residency policy, intersected properties, second vote. We had the first reading 2 weeks ago. We discussed a number of small changes that needed to be made to clarify certain aspects of the language. Those changes have been made. I just want to go over once again for everybody what exactly the new policy says. It sets a new standard of 25% or greater assessed gross building area with at least some finished living space as for intersected properties to qualify as being in the public schools of Brookline District. That is a new standard, consistent with the Teal decision, and we were all comfortable with that for any properties going forward. The policy has exceptions or grandfather clauses for all children currently living in any intersected property dwelling unit that was previously recognized as eligible, even if that unit doesn't meet the new standard. So that pertains to both rental units and to single-family owned units. And it grandfathers any children now or in the future, in other words, upon resale of the property, in single-family units that were purchased with the understanding that they were in the public schools of Brookline. The provision, that grandfather provision for those properties would be nullified for any property that is converted to condominium and or adds a residence unit to the property. So, in other words, changes to the property that develop it into more than just a single family unit would mean it and any new units would all be subject to the 25% rule. There has been some conversation about whether, so the language that changed from the draft that we looked at last week was just to clarify that it's 25% of the dwelling unit, not 25% of the property. And under A subsection small I2, it says any children of families who reside now or in the future. That's a change from whoever reside. Again, we have a lot of families, understandably, with all of the conversation around this, who just want to be crystal clear of what the intent is of this, and that if they go forward with sale of their property, that it's understood that it is the dwelling unit itself and not just the children in it that are grandfathered. And I think that that language makes that more clear. The only question I had for the committee is whether or not we want to specify under A subsection 1I, dwelling units in intersected multifamily buildings prior to the adoption of this policy. If we were to make this truly a mirror of subsection 2, we would say dwelling units in intersected multifamily rental buildings prior to the adoption of this policy to distinguish it from intersected single-family dwelling units purchased as PSB eligible. I would put that out there as the committee can certainly discuss it, but that may further clarify and not force people to look into the legislative record to interpret it. But leave it open to you. I didn't feel that it absolutely needed that clarification, but some of the commentary that we've got suggested to me that it might be helpful. So I leave it up to you. But that is, other than that, there are no changes from our conversation the last time we were here. Happy to take, so I would move this to vote the policy. Invite a second and any comments.
Is there a second?
Second.
And from the point of view of the clarification, are you moving it with the small clarification that you just mentioned or not?
I'm not moving that clarification. I put it out there in case others felt that it would be helpful.
Okay. So on that, before we take a vote.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It was circulated and you don't have it in front of you, because it was circulated. Did you not get it? Okay, it should have come to you on the... There's some copies here. Thank you. It was 2 days ago. It was Tuesday. It was circulated on Tuesday. because I care. I circulated it to you on Tuesday.
So could you just go over that one little?
I'm so sorry. Once everybody has it in front of them. So in front of you, you have the first three paragraphs. First three paragraphs that establish the 25% and the determination of gross building area subject to the Brookline Town Assessor. And again, in case properties under construction are not yet assessed, the PSB administration may rely on estimates from other relevant town departments. So that's under exceptions. The change I described to you was in A2, where it used to say children of families who ever reside, and that's changed to any children of families who reside now or in the future in those dwelling units. So that clarifies, I believe, clarifies the resale value, the resale issue, and the resale value. And then the question is whether or not, because 2 specifically says intersected single-family dwelling units purchased as PSB eligible, whether or not we wanted to be clear that the multifamily buildings referred to in 1 are multifamily rental buildings. We have multifamily buildings in Brookline that are not rental apartments. They are condominiums. And so the policy is clear that we are referring to individual dwelling units, but in the case of the Longwood Towers, for example, it's a very large multifamily building that was converted from rental to condominium. And so I just wanted to know whether we wanted to clarify in I, dwelling units in intersected multifamily rental buildings.
Yes, Mr. Chang.
I had actually raised that with Ms. Stone before, but after reading the language, I thought it does not need the word rental because I thought it's pretty clear the way it's written at this point. So I'm happy with the current version.
Okay.
Okay. Ms. Gatto?
It seems to me that if you don't put rental in there, why is it clear that, why would it be clear that those are eligible?
We don't have any current multifamily buildings except the one at Beacon Street.
Right, but I'm thinking, but if you have if you have 2 or 3 condos in a building, that's a multifamily.
But that's an intersected single-family dwelling unit that was purchased.
Keyword is purchased.
It's purchased, okay? So if I have a dwelling unit.
A single-family dwelling unit purchased.
But if I purchase.
Which is what a condominium is. So even if that condominium is in a multi-family structure, it is still a single-family dwelling unit purchased. So that's
Right.
why that language is written the way it is.
It's the purchase, okay, I see.
Okay, we have a motion in front of us with the wording as it stands, and we have a second. Are there any other comments? Hearing none. On that basis, all those in favor, please raise your hand. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Once again, Ms. Stone, I want to thank you and your committee for the labors that you have gone through regarding this. It was a complex and somewhat controversial activity, and I think it's ended up very well. And I appreciate that, and I know everybody else does as well. Thanks.
Thank you, and my thanks to everybody who weighed in on this from the community and from the committee. Extremely helpful in getting to this conclusion. We meet next on February 5th at 8:30 a.m. We will be focusing our laser-like beam on after-school programming and use or coordination of school space and rental, taking taking up finally Ms. Cox's good work on that. So there is a memo outlining the issues that will be before us, but there is no policy recommendation. We're simply looking at how to address the many issues that may come up in our review of those policies.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Ditkoff, anything on the Override Study Committee?
Nothing to report.
Very good. We'll proceed.
So, seeing the lateness of the hour and the fact that it's been a late week, I'm just going to say a couple of things. I mean, one is that I think, I'm not sure where we were the last time we all met here, but one of the things that this bridge budget, as it's being called, is essentially to remind all of us, and I don't intend to steal any of Dr. Lupini's thunder, but for our purposes, this is the second year of a bridge budget. The first year of a bridge budget was really a squeak through, can we possibly do without an override, because next year the structural deficit that we have been talking about for quite some time will be addressed in an override conversation, that the use of one-time money that we have been talking about for a number of years will be addressed, the 35% growth in our K-8 schools with no growth in the revenue beyond the typical will be addressed. So I think that, at least from the perspective of this committee, last year was the bridge budget. What we're trying to do this year, and in fact, the school committee, if I recall, was trying to be as fiscally responsible as possible to live within its means last year, and made a number of quite difficult, had a number of very difficult and painful conversations around cuts that we would be contemplating around music and ECS and other things. And I say this only to remind folks that at the end of that process last year, where at the end of the day we decided to not make those cuts and we decided to instead sort of continue the use of one-time money. This was a very long, complicated conversation with the school committee, the superintendent, multiple budgets, multiple iterations. The advisory committee was involved, the town school partnership. It really was a town-wide conversation along with hundreds and hundreds of parents. So I think at the end of that, there was a resounding, let's not do that again, as the message. And so what that meant was that we continued to fund at what we said at the time was unsustainable levels, and we all sat there and looked at each other. I don't mean school committee, I mean school committee, advisory committee, board of selectmen, town meeting, all of the parents. We all, as a town leadership, had this conversation. And so what at the end of that was, and next year we're going to be in an override conversation where we lay out what these structural deficits are, what it would really take to, have an educational excellence budget, and we'll go from there. I understand that there are a very large number of people who are emailing me, and perhaps you, quite disappointed that there isn't an override recommendation of some sort that's coming out of the Override Study Committee. And there are a variety of reasons why we are where we are. I'll point out one, which is that when the Board of Selectmen gave a mandate in August with a March 1st deadline, there were some assumptions built into that. Either, number one, that the Override Study Committee would start with the reports that had already been done from the B-Space Committee, from other committees around town, HMFH, MGT, there were all sorts of external consultants who had been engaged to provide analysis. And so I think there was a general sense that there was a pretty good starting point for this committee. And in addition to doing its due diligence, it was largely going to take those reports as a starting point. Certainly nothing precluded the Override Study Committee from instead deciding to open every box and look under every rock, which is certainly its prerogative. But I think that as one thinks about a March 1st deadline and how much can be accomplished in a certain amount of time, you sort of have to pick your poison, if you will, which is that either you look under every rock, open every box, re-question every assumption in every report, in which case which is fine, it's a perfectly legitimate path, but it is not going to be ready for a March 1st deadline by any stretch of the imagination without help from a professional consultant, which was proposed to the committee. I was in favor of that. All of you were in favor of that. My co-chairman, Dick Benko, was in favor of that, but the committee decided it did not want an external consultant. It decided it wanted to do the work itself. So when you put these things together, the implication of that is that the work is not finished by a March 1st deadline. A different path would have been to largely accept the basic premise as even 80% correct, 90% correct of the reports that the override study was given, and spend the last number of months crafting, doing due diligence, of course, but crafting an override recommendation. And since it chose this interesting path, it's been kind of we are where we are, is what I will say. And so what that means is that if every box is going to get opened, a March 1st deadline is not going to get hit. And so therefore, this is the situation we find ourselves in. And I understand that that has created a great deal of frustration among people on multiple, from multiple camera angles. People who are expecting an override and aren't seeing it. People who were expecting the fact that they wanted a greater amount of the override study committee's work to be significantly reflected in this year's budget, which it is to some extent, but because that committee's work isn't done, it can't be fully reflected. So I think that the good news is that the override study committee is looking with a fairly fine-tooth comb at pretty much every decision, every assumption, calling up consultants on demographics who have not been engaged by the town in some number of years, and some of them have left the firms they're in, and we're recalling them from their new jobs back onto the phone to explain regression analyses that they ran and recalculate the numbers with us on the phone. I can't make this up. Helen was there, Alan was there, Mr. Rowe was there. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. We were doing regressions by conference call. If any, that was earlier this week. If any of you need other things to do, you can come join us. So anyway, so at the end of this, I think it will be quite challenging for anyone to say that there were questions that somehow weren't asked. So I'm going to take that as good news somehow. And so what that means is that we're kind of in this year 2 of a bridge budget, which I think the word bridge is, that metaphor is fast losing its explanatory power, mostly because there were a couple things that the town administrator said. One is that the point of having a bridge is to let the committee continue to do its important work, and therefore create a situation where the committee's work can continue, but in the meantime, again, in the let's not do that again theory, that we would not have major cuts. There would not be major service cuts. There would not be major programmatic cuts. There would be no major policy changes that were big and complicated, that would have to get deliberated through multiple rounds of public hearing and be so anyway, I think that the question then is, is there a way to build such a bridge, or whatever metaphor we want to use, along those lines? And I think there's one phrase which is causing a little bit of confusion among, I think, school committee members that I've spoken to, override study committee members, which is the phrase that that this budget would be sustainable without an override, which is something that folks heard the town administrator say. It created a little bit of confusion because the current budget isn't sustainable without an override, and so there's no way a bridge will be sustainable without an override. So I think that was causing a little bit of confusion with some people. But anyway, the general principle is to more or less keep things intact, try to make some progress on the most important, I know we're not using the word catch-up item anymore either, but are the most important areas where we feel that enrollment growth has outstripped our ability to provide the right educational environment. Clearly it won't be everything, but it will be filling the most important needs. So I think that there are, again, many, many things that the Override Study Committee has deliberated and discussed in its revenue committee, in the schools, the two schools committees, and the capital committee, which have already informed the thinking and deliberation as the school staff, the town staff, the leadership on both sides has put their budgets together. So I think that's, which is a tremendous service, but the work of the committee is not done, and what we're currently trying to do is figure out what is the right timeline to complete the committee's work, given the outstanding questions. So with that, I'm not going to go into where the status of each of the 8 subcommittees, because there was a 3-hour meeting on that last night, so feel free to watch the video. And I will also say that there was a public hearing 2 weeks ago where there was a tremendous amount of interest in from residents on a number of the programs that we've talked about. There was a lot of resident testimony on the METCO issue about how it affects them and their educational experience as residents. Specifically, we had some African-American students and other families who just explored how meaningful it was to them as residents. We had a lot of testimony on the materials fee question. We heard on a number of other issues as well, class size among them and some others. I think one important thing that came out was it really spoke to many of the speeches were about values, things that they valued in the educational system. What there was as framing for that conversation was an overall number of an 11% increase in taxes. There was not a dollar amount assigned to specific line items within that. But frankly, very few people think that had there been dollar amounts associated with every line item, that those testimonies would have been substantially different. Certainly there were people who spoke, and probably another 2 or 3 dozen people who emailed us who spoke about the overall size of the override and the impact that that might have on low or moderate or fixed income people in town, and those are very important considerations. And a couple of people I think a couple people at the public hearing said the same thing, but there were very few discussions of people who said, this program costs X amount of money and I support it, or this program costs Y amount of money and therefore I don't support it. It was not at that level. So I think that the committee in general, because the whole point of the committee is to get to an override number or some modules, modular numbers, and have a sense of what the community's reaction is likely to be on those, that costing out, understanding the fully loaded costs of the programs that we're running, regardless of whether or not the Override Study Committee chooses to endorse or not endorse that program, understanding that fact base and getting agreement on the fact base is absolutely critical, because otherwise it's very, very difficult to have an informed fact-based discussion. So the work of the committee past this point, just to sort of finish that thought, is to say, what are the most important issues, either on the cost side or the revenue side, that could be affecting this? What are some of the consequences or trade-offs that are embedded in making those changes? What are some of the implementation challenges or not? So, for example, there are often heated discussions about a particular topic, and then the implementability comes up, and then there's almost no point in having that discussion. So trying to keep that lens of reality as practical as possible for the people at this table and elsewhere who need to actually make decisions based on this information. So that's all sort of in the mix over the next number of months to try to tie that up. And the different subcommittees are in different places on that. So it's been a complicated set of discussions. I'm sure others who've observed it may have things they wish to chime in on, but I just wanted to set that framing a little bit about where we are and what we're up to. And if there are specific questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Thank you, Ms. Ditkoff. Brilliant summary. Are there questions for Ms. Ditkoff, please? No questions from the committee. I can vouch for a number of the comments regarding meetings that I attended as well, and it was very accurately stated. All right.
Oh,
yes.
It's not a question for Ms. Ditkoff, who I think has answered enough questions on all of this. The statement that you made, Mr. Morse, at the public hearing,
Yes.
I was wondering if that is available on our website. There's been a little bit of traffic on the town meeting members list, which suggested to me that that town meeting members who were not in attendance at the public hearing are unaware of the what was in the statement that you had made. I think it would answer a couple of questions. So
If it's not there now, we'll make sure it is.
okay, great. Thank you.
Right, thanks for saying that. Okay, very briefly regarding additional liaisons. Are there other additional liaisons that people wish to cover? Ms. Cox, we'll take you first.
Do you want me to do the Hancock Village now?
No, you're right about that. Ms. Chalupsky.
So I have a couple little things. First, just to finish off the capital improvements, I do remember what I forgot to say. Our next meeting will be February 24th from 8 till 9:30. On Monday, I was at the Beep Connections meeting once more, and I still continue to be amazed by that group and what they've been able to pull together on no budget and just goodwill from everybody in town. It's really, it makes you proud to live in this town when people can come together like that. BATV is going to be doing another CD, reading one. They're doing it in collaboration with the high school class that does the videography, I think it is. And they're very excited about it also. So that's the one piece that's going to be happening, along with a visit to the Puppet Show Place for the Parent-Child Home Program participants, utilizing some of the Steps to Success kids to help in this. So it's just everybody's at the table, and we meet at the teen center. So all of that has been really good. In addition, on Wednesday, I've been involved with early childhood this week, in case you didn't notice. I was at the Early Education for All Strategies for Children meeting, where they introduced their new executive director, who's to be hired, Chris Martis, who happened to have been our head of HR at one point, the head of MASS, executive director for that, and superintendent in a number of places along the way. So Chris will be taking over for Caroline Lyons, who's done a really good job in the last couple of years, but has decided to move on. So I thought people might be interested in hearing about that. There seems to be a little bit more money in the at least in the governor's budget for early childhood, and that's a good thing because we will certainly benefit from some of that. There's also an interesting grant for collaboration between public and private. Small money, there's only $2 million for it, so I'm not sure we would even qualify to get it. It may go more towards some of the big cities, but certainly something to look into. I had forwarded it actually to Vicki to take a look. We're also at EDCO last week. Firstly, the forum will be on March 27th at the State House from 10 to 12. I think I mentioned that last time, but I just wanted to repeat it. I did get the notice of it, and I'm not sure if other people got it or not. You did? Okay, so then I don't have to forward it to everybody so you get your mailboxes all stuffed. I think I'll leave the big issue about EDCO to your report, or do you want to do it that way? Okay. Whatever.
Sure, might as well.
So, okay, thanks. So, last week we heard a presentation from the administration and the executive committee. EDCO, because of its current lease arrangement and the fact that the space that they have is usable only as office and meeting room, and quite frankly doesn't represent a lot of meeting room space for professional development. And they're currently located, as you may know, in Waltham. There's a desire to expand special education programming at EDCO, and there's a desire, because of the lack of programming space in schools, to find a space that will accommodate professional development, office, and special education programming. I need to say up front on that particular issue, from the time I chaired the board at North Shore, I've been concerned about the issue of least restrictive environment and collaborative programming. And if you'll give me just a minute on that. Collaboratives are supposed to be a step in between public school programs and private schools. And unfortunately, because of some of the policies of organizations in the Commonwealth, historically MSBA being one of them, and their failure historically, although things are changing, to support collaborative programming rooms in public school buildings, we've driven many collaborative programs, classes, to office buildings, where they are no different on a least restrictive environment measure than a private school. And so the U.S. Department of Education has historically been concerned about this and has written a number of interesting letters to collaboratives and the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And we continue to offend those national policies in this area. So I have, and I express them there, I have concerns about that issue and continue to have concerns about that issue. But more importantly, early on in this process, I was concerned about where EDCO might relocate. Because EDCO represents a very large geographic area, and not only a very large geographic area, but a very difficult to navigate geographic area at certain times of the day. So if you're going to move programs to a place, and if you're going to move all the professional development to that place, it needs to be accessible to member districts. And early on in meetings, that was my one ask. Given that we are the furthest away generally from the center of this particular organization, that was my one ask. And so when the recommendation came forward to recommend this space on 36 Middlesex Turnpike in Bedford off of Route 3, I'm not pleased. I'm not pleased for our programming, and I'm not pleased for our teachers. Because at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 5:30 in the afternoon, 8 o'clock in the morning, to get there for programming, to get there for professional development will be very difficult.
Get there for board meetings.
I'll quote my colleague in Newton who says, simply put, actually Dr. Fisher-Mueller's counterpart in Newton, who said, simply put, our teachers won't go. And I'm concerned about that. And so I expressed at this meeting that even though I understand this is wonderful space, that I will be voting against this proposal on February 6th when the board meets to consider the proposal. I was asked, as I said in the report, because that's not normal in collaboratives and the way they work, the way collaborative boards work. I was asked what that meant to Brookline's membership in EDCO, and I said that it was extremely premature to have that conversation, but that I would need to come back and consider some of these factors and talk to leadership team, senior staff, talk with the school committee who ultimately makes that decision, and make a recommendation to you as to our future involvement or our future membership in this collaborative. And that's what I intend to do as we proceed. So I can't provide them with an answer to that question right now, other than to say to you, if you're in a collaborative that's a special education collaborative and a professional development collaborative, and you don't believe your people are going to access those things, I have to question why you would belong.
Just to add to this, I'm on the executive committee, and Bill is on the finance committee, but at the meeting where the executive committee discussed this, I brought up this issue that, Bill had talked about it from the beginning. I mean, to be fair to them, there were only 3 bids, and all the bids were out that far. So that, and they did hire a real estate company to look for places. Apparently, there were no other spaces. Certainly, the space is cheap. It's like $12 a square foot or something like that. And it's a whole building. And, in the sense of if you could take that building, because I went there, I actually drove it. In good times, it's 48 minutes. With traffic, it's a good hour. No, at rush hour, it's a good hour. I got stuck there was that accident on 95 where the woman died. I happened to, it was backed up on both sides. Yes.
Sorry if this question's not, Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Please.
How many current children are we talking about that could be affected, and how many staff, and what would some of the alternatives be if we were to, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I'm just curious about the timing. Is it something we could certainly manage on a school year basis so kids aren't disrupted?
So first of all, so it's early for that question, but and one of the complicating factors is that we're talking about building program. EDCO is not historically a special education collaborative. You've heard me say that. It's one of my frustrations with that collaborative. And many of the other member districts belong to 2 or more. They use one for special education. They use EDCO for professional development.
And if I could just add one little piece, what's interesting is that most of the programs are in school buildings right now.
That's right. So there's a move afoot here to move some of those programs and expand them. And to build things like 45-day placement programs, which we'll all need under the new discipline law. So there's the number of students we have in EDCO programs now, and there's the number of students that Karen and I in our conversations have envisioned having in them down the road. That's where my problem was. Right, a 45-day placement program that far away, quite frankly, I have private school placement programs that are better. I will go this far. So there are a couple of districts around us, our size or slightly larger. There have been conversations over the years, you can call it a collaborative, you can call it a consortium, you can call it sharing programs, about whether those districts would begin to look at the inventory of their programs and figure out what each of them have and what they don't have, and build maybe what they need as a 3-school system group, and have those conversations. I do believe that my colleagues in those other districts are interested in such a conversation, that their special education people are interested in such a conversation, and it could be something that we might have in the near future. That's a different issue than professional development. We'll have to look at the numbers. Quite frankly, as mandates have increased, more and more of our professional development is centered around those mandates, and it's done here.
If I could just add one more piece, there's a sizable investment that will have to go into this too.
Right.
EDCO does have some reserves from a grant that it had gotten, or a donation it had gotten a number of years ago, but this will help to sort of not wipe it out totally, but do a good chunk of that by renting this space. Also, to be fair, at the meeting, at least one district said if we were to leave because of this move, then they wouldn't want to vote for this. So there was some support, for.
Yeah, and the other thing that's going on that's really interesting, and this is more related to the collaborative commission that I was on than this particular issue. Districts are beginning to look at some of these issues around multiple collaborative memberships. You all know Ann Wilson, who's now in Sudbury. Sudbury Public Schools belong to 3 collaboratives. Now, that's terrific in terms of programming for their students, but to Ms. Charlupski's earlier point, it means that Dr. Wilson sits on 3 boards that meet quite often, and her school committee is very concerned about the amount of time for a special education director or superintendent that are being taken up by that, and they're reconsidering that decision of 3 collaboratives. They are not the only district around that is looking at that type of decision And you'll remember that some of the work in the Collaborative Commission was meant to figure out ways for these organizations to not merge necessarily, but at least create lead organizations that might provide this array of services. And by being a member of that one, you would also have some membership in this one and have access to those. So those things are starting to play out as districts are looking closer at.
So what I'd like to do, we're going to have to come back to this because we're going to have to vote one way or another. So a lot of these questions are going to come up again. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay with everybody, is, oh, that's all right. You're allowed to be passionate once in a while. If there's anything really, oh, I've signed these. Thank you. Yes, right. If there's anything that you think you want to say now that you won't be able to say later, that's fine. But otherwise, I'd prefer to go on, if that's all right.
Later.
At a next, we'll have to come back for a vote and a discussion at that time.
We'll have to come back on the property or on other recommendations or something at another time. This won't be the last time we'll discuss this.
Right.
I had a question that I think has a quick answer, and it's just to be able to put this conversation in context. We don't actually talk about EDCO and our involvement with EDCO that often. Do we pay dues to EDCO?
Oh, yes.
What are those dues every year?
Mr. Rowe, can you tell us, I'm sorry to ask you off the top of your head, but the EDCO.
$32,000, I believe.
$32,000 a year. So presumably, if a district belongs to multiple,
Right, plus what we pay for professional development workshops on top of that.
okay. So part of our conversation is what are we getting for our $32,000 a year?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you. And
If we have students at the Manville program, which I think we do, we get a reduction in the rate. So we get, remember, reduction for both
Right.
the professional development and the, if we use it, and any programs that we have kids in.
okay. And the
Okay.
only other question that I wanted for clarity is whether or not you are the only voice at the table saying this within EDCO.
So, at the urging of one of my colleagues last week, I asked for a straw vote on this. And as you might imagine, early on in this kind of conversation, after only a 2-hour presentation, there were, I think, 1 or 2 people who said they would absolutely vote for this. There were a large number of people who said they couldn't make a commitment at that time, and then there was 1 no. I have talked to a number of colleagues since who are, as Ms. Charlupski has said, uncomfortable voting for this proposal if other districts are against it, and/or are uncomfortable with the drive themselves, and you could probably figure out who some of them are. Just real quick, the one other point that I made, is that, you know, if you look at where they're relocating the program to, and if you did that, it's bad enough if you just look at the drive and each of our districts. It's worse if you look at the larger districts and the drive. They are moved the furthest away from the 2 largest districts,
Yes.
which to me is unacceptable.
I know, I appreciate the problem, and I appreciate your position on it. I was just trying to gauge
Yes.
whether or not you were waging a one-man war.
No, I am not.
Or whether or not there is large support.
Based on conversations I had today, I am certainly not.
Okay, thank you.
So the vote on this, is this coming Thursday, the 6th?
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Cox, you were going to start us off on the 40B.
So I want to apologize for ducking out of last school committee meeting, but I was headed upstairs at 7 o'clock. The Zoning Board of Appeals was having a hearing to listen to the presentation of Chestnut Hill Realty on the 40B proposal for Hancock Village. And that presentation can actually be found on the the Planning Department's website if anyone is interested in the details. I think a lot of you are familiar with it. We know that it has implications, particularly for the Baker School, but for our school enrollments at the high school as well down the line, possibly townwide. So just to reiterate for those who might not remember, this proposal involves building 192 new units housing. 39 of those would be affordable housing. There's the plan for a 3 to 4 story apartment building that would have about 116 units, mainly 1 and 2 bedroom. As Chestnut Hill Realty presented it, it would be, they envision mostly residents who want 1-floor living, empty nesters, single professionals. But there will also be some infill buildings, 76 units of 2.5-story townhouses, and those will include some 28 3-bedroom and 28 4-bedroom units, which they're building with the intention that they would be good places for families. So the hearing was largely taken up with the presentation of Chestnut Hill Realty. There was no opportunity for question or comment. There will be a second hearing on February 13th, where the town's boards and commissions are invited to submit public comment. In the meantime, the zoning board is conducting some of its own studies on some of the issues around this development that have arisen, including traffic and drainage. I believe there was a site visit last week where the zoning board and anyone interested was invited to tour the area of proposed development. As I said before, this is an area of interest to the schools. It's not something that we participated in prior hearings about because we were told that the schools was not going to be an issue of consideration as this went through mass development. The letter approving it from mass development came through on October 8th, 2013, which unfortunately was a month after we closed our B-Space process and issued our B-Space report. And we are hearing from the planning department that there is an ability to raise a school issue if it seems like a 40B proposal might impact long-term school expansion, construction, space strategy. And so Mr. Morris has drafted a letter or statement that the school committee could present at the next hearing, and I think that was circulated to everyone. And I guess we are inviting your comment. But
yeah, so I'll pick it up for there. The people may remember that I did make a comment at a hearing with the Board of Selectmen when they held a hearing about this that was designed to, at that time, we didn't think that any school issue would have any effect, but it was an opportunity for me to let the Board of Selectmen and the public know that there were dire implications for us, both financially and from a space point of view. So then we were alerted that if the project would have a substantial negative effect on a long-term capital plan that we had, that it might in fact enable the town to make a justifiable objection to the proposal. And so I gave the presentation that I'd made to the Board of Selectmen to Ms. Maher, and we talked about how it could be changed in order to make it effective in connection with what we had learned, and actually I want to give her credit for having done that draft, and she's still working on it, and I want to give Ms. Cox credit for having looked at the draft and having made some good suggestions which were incorporated. So the draft is still rough, but it might be, we're not quite sure when my presentation might be made, either the 6th, which is a possibility, or maybe later than that. I think the 24th or somewhere around then of February. But in any event, if it was going to be on the 11th, not the 6th, but the 11th or the 13th, this would be my only opportunity to have you look at it ahead of time, just from a conceptual point of view. So that's why I distribute it. Not that it's if anybody wants to make any comments, either to me or here now, that's fine. Otherwise, I just wanted you to have a sense as to what I would be doing, because once again, I would be representing you all in this, and so you can either comment on it now, or and not from an editor point of view, but just from a conceptual point of view. If there's anything that concerns you, or if you have any ideas, either now or you can email them to me.
You would take comments. I haven't had a chance to look at it, so I'd be happy to give comments, but I don't want to take the time.
Yeah, no, I think that I'm always happy to take comments from our chief editor, both from a policy point of view and from an editing point of view. So that would be great if you want to do that. And you would, if you would copy, if you're going to, you can either make them verbally, or if you're going to send me an email, then if you would copy Ms. Maher, that would be very, very good as well. Okay. Yes, Ms. Scotto.
At the end of the second page, you talk about the high school, the possibility of needing a second high school. And the only thing that I would say in that paragraph, I would emphasize something about the cost of that high school, not only the fact that we would need a second high school, but that even if, but that we can't afford to build a second high school, but that's the bottom line. So I think having that financial issue in that second paragraph is a good one.
Great.
I mean, that second, it's the first paragraph on the next to the last page at the end, I'm sorry.
Great. Okay. We have that, right? Thank you. And if there are no other suggestions, I'd like to go on. And this is time for public comment. If there is anybody who would like to make public comment. There is no one signed up for public comment, and I would just, if there's anybody who would like to make a public comment now, even though you're not signed up, we won't fine you, and you can still make a public comment. Seeing no one, we should proceed. And Dr. Lupini, I think you're up for your report, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. What did I do? Thank you, Mr. Morris. So a number of items tonight. The item that will be with us, I think, through the spring, the Park Field Test update. Remember, our K-8 schools, all of them will be participating in the Park Assessment Field Test. We're continuing to provide information for principals, now teachers, parents, guardians, to ensure that they're well informed. I want to thank Ms. Maher for the work that she's done in establishing a link on the website, which will be ready, I think, early next week, with all of the information that's available, both from the Department of Education, information we've sent out. It's sort of just a repository of information for parents on Park, and it's well appreciated. So thank you for that work. In addition, Dr. Fisher-Mueller has established, and I appreciate her efforts on this very, very much, a Park, I'll call it, support team for our principals, our teachers, people in buildings that are taking care of all of the issues associated with implementing this field test, and they are considerable, from making sure student names are registered to trying to coordinate what this will look like in terms of the technology and the paper pencil versions, all of those kinds of things. And that team includes Patricia Kinsella, Karen Wolfson, Scott Moore, Corey Stott, our new Director of Research and Accountability, and Megan Marr, our Director of Community Engagement. I have received a few emails that I saw today from Ms. Stott, who is just really on top of a variety of issues. There's an issue that came up today just around students with disabilities for whom the accommodations in their IEPs don't necessarily match those available for Park, even though they were available in MCAS, and what do we do? Do they take the Park? Do they take the MCAS, even though everyone else in their grade level will be taking Park? And that's just one of the problems that this group of people are handling, multiple problems that are coming up on a daily basis, and it's quite incredible work. They did a wonderful, wonderful presentation with the principals on Monday, and you could sense the relief that there were people paying attention to these issues on a daily basis. So, Dr. Fisher-Mueller, thank you for your work in putting that team together, and the fact that it's such a great team of people. So thank you. And that team will, as I said, coordinate preparation, lead training for staff, provide communication, and maintain a district-wide view of the field test in Brookline. In terms of student and staff recognition, I want to highlight tonight our Sagamore and the students who work on the Sagamore, the student newspaper at Brookline High School. They are one of 27 finalists for the Columbia Scholastic Press Association Crown Awards, given to a student print or digital medium for overall excellence. And they will find out this spring what type of award within that program they will win. We also want to highlight the two advisors, Lindsay Wise and Marcella Anderson, who just do a terrific job working on that student newspaper with our students. Our staff recognition is for Lindsay Wise, who is an English teacher at Brookline High School and the faculty advisor of the Sagamore, who is now a certified journalism educator. She recently passed the Journalism Education Association Mastery Exam and will be honored in April at their National High School convention. And Lindsay does amazing work and has done amazing work on our student newspaper for a number of years. On Friday the 24th, Commissioner Chester was here in our schools. He spent time at the Devotion School in classrooms. He spent time at the Lawrence School in classrooms, and then joined a group of us, including Ms. Stone and Ms. Ditkoff, for a discussion of our literacy initiatives, which was coordinated by Dr. Fisher-Mueller and really put together by Ms. Kinsella and Janae Ramos, an English teacher from the high school who does such wonderful work with the content reading initiative. Dr. Chester's visit was terrific. He was marvelous in classrooms with students. We essentially had to pry him out of classrooms because that's where he wanted to be. And it was really a great experience for our students, our teachers, our principals to see him in that environment. It was very, very, very enjoyable morning with the commissioner, and in terms of the note that I received from him for the commissioner. So I want to thank everyone who took part in the panel, and in particular Jennifer Flewelling and Rick Rogers for putting together those visits, and to Ms. Marr, who actually put together the entire program that morning for the commissioner's visit with his press people. Last item I have is around high school accreditation. You know that there's an ongoing conversation about NEASC. You probably know by now that I think there are 3 or 4 districts that have suspended all NEASC-related activity until we see what the results of these conversations look like. They include Newton, they include Reading, they now include the Bedford Public Schools, and there are others that I'm forgetting right now. Of course, you know that Burlington has dropped out of NEASC. I've been working with the headmaster on what our response will be, whether we'll follow along with those districts. We're in a little different position in that those districts, many of them were entering an accreditation visit. We're only at a point where we're looking at a 2-year report in response to an accreditation visit. But I believe there's good reason to justify that we should follow the actions of our colleagues in taking those steps. I believe they're having an effect. There's a panel that's been set up by the new executive director at NEASC. He's brought in a number of people with experience in high schools and with accreditation, including Mike Konopasis, the former assistant superintendent and then superintendent in Boston. I think bringing Mike in and some others really demonstrates that he's paying attention to this issue. and is interested in trying to find a more streamlined process that meets the needs of districts and that would be less costly. And so I think these actions that districts have taken are having an impact, and that we need to be part of those efforts. So Ms. Holman and I are looking at making a recommendation to you sometime before the end of February on exactly what we believe Brookline High School's stance should be on this. That's my report.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, there are. Ms. Cotto.
Can you talk a little bit about the accreditation process? If we do, I don't mean what we do, but if we don't belong to NEASC, what is the path by which we get accreditation?
So we're not suggesting at this point that one of the options under consideration is to not be a member of NEASC. We're suggesting that we would suspend activities related to our accreditation. That's different. Okay? So we're not suggesting at this point. Only Burlington that I know of has chosen no longer to be a member of NEASC. These other districts have not made that choice. They've suspended interaction
so we just
with.
Don't do the
That's
next
correct.
step, is what you're
We
saying.
are accredited. Our high school is accredited by NEASC. You know, longer term, what a number of districts have done, not so much in New England, but what you find in other parts of the country is there are other accreditation bureaus. There are other accreditation processes. David Fleischman in Newton speaks fondly, and I've met the executive director there, of a group that they formed when a number of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut districts dropped out of middle states. Well, actually, in Connecticut, they dropped out of NEASC. And they formed their own. And it's a terrific process where they identify a problem of practice that they're working on, and a team comes in to give them feedback around that problem of practice. For example, I'll give you, and they don't do it for only their high school, they do it for their district. So I'll give you an example. My colleague Jerry Hockman, who some of you may remember from Amherst, is now in Bedford, New York. And what they do, they have one coming up, and they've centered it around the use of time. Right? So the team that will come in will pay attention to what's going on in their schools in terms of the use of time, particularly passing times and what kind of time, an issue we've talked about a number of times, right, in instructional rounds, how time is used in the classroom, pull out for students who have ELL services or whatever. They're going to analyze that issue, right? And the member districts of that collaborative find it very useful. They negotiated an agreement, that collaborative, with middle states that for districts that go through that, they get the equivalent of middle states accreditation. So there are many ways to address this if that's where we were to end up. I think what we all share in common is what we hope is that NEASC addresses our concerns. Does that answer your question?
Yes, exactly.
Ms. Kershaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question on the park, and it's something that the team's probably already well on top of, but I'm aware that lucky youngsters across the district are participating in MCAS tutoring as we speak. And it occurred to me that for someone who qualified for MCAS tutoring, if they didn't get proficient in the year before, they have this great opportunity to participate in tutoring to prepare them for the MCAS. So for the kids who didn't get proficient on MCAS and qualify for that tutoring but are scheduled to take PARC in the coming year, how are we supporting the remedial work that they need to be doing in test prep?
I would imagine that right now, any student who did not gain proficiency in MCAS for last spring and who is in any form of MCAS support right now and is assigned to take the PARC field test would not be pulled from that MCAS tutoring.
So they'll be getting that level of support through MCAS, but it may or may not exactly align with what, I mean, I know the support is probably general in terms of from strategies for test taking and content related to, so I just want to be sure that we're maximizing the benefit to those kids who you know, we're not only not going to see what their scores are in terms of growth from the year that they didn't achieve proficiency, so we won't get sort of the benefit of knowing whether that tutoring really supported them. So I just want to make sure that they're still at least getting.
Measured by MCAS, you're correct.
As measured by MCAS, right. Last question. Do you think Commissioner Chester enjoyed Miles Kershaw Finzey's science notebook? Because I heard he had a nice, good, long look at it. Just kidding.
I do, yes. It was the high. It was absolutely the highlight of his visit. Yeah.
Ms. Ditko.
There were two highlights for me of Commissioner Chester's visit. One was when Dr. Fisher-Mueller perfectly encapsulated the challenge of all of the different initiatives that he was raining down upon the districts in this Commonwealth. It was beautiful. It was succinct. It was to the point. It was clear and polite, and very clear, polite, and clear. Put it that way.
And what was his response?
He nodded. The second, actually, here, so the second highlight for me was when he called Dr. Lupini a leader among leaders. I think was the word, and I can only imagine that was not in reference to Dr. Lupini's upcoming presidency of the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. But in fact was a reference to Dr. Lupini's own polite, clear, and polite and clear advocacy on some of the issues that we have heard him be clear, polite, and clear on. So that was a highlight. Those were two highlights for me.
Great. Yes, Ms. Stone.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just piggyback briefly on Ms. Ditkoff's clear, polite, and clear comment. Dr. Lupini, when Dr. Fisher-Mueller made that presentation with her chart held high to demonstrate to the commissioner what was going on, you mentioned that you and Dr. Fisher-Mueller had been invited to share that issue with someone, but I did not catch who that was, and I wondered if you could tell us.
Sure. Maureen LaCroix, former superintendent in Bedford, who now does some consulting work at the department to help them communicate their message to the public, including superintendents, strangely enough, is responsible for coordinating a project to bring together initiatives to actually form a calendar as to how they overlap and don't. And so she asked me quite some time ago, and I needed to circle back with her as to when we're going to try to do that, as to whether Dr. Fisher-Mueller and I would be interested in helping them do that by taking a look at some of their early drafts.
Okay. We have, sorry, are there any more questions or comments? Okay, we have now a committee action on the revisions to the Bullying Prevention and Intervention Master Plan. Who, Dr. Lupini?
Yes.
Would you present that, please?
No.
Okay.
So it is as Dr. Schmuckler presented the last time. These, still not. It is on now. So these issues concern only the matter of adults.
Yes.
They are all of the provisions that are related to that particular change in the law, which occurred in July of 2013. Right. And I believe Dr. Schmuckler reviewed those with you the last time. I'm happy to try to answer any questions if there are any remaining before the committee would take action on this. I just want to thank Dr. Schmuckler again for her work on ensuring that our master plan and other documents are up to date and submitted to the department.
So she did make a presentation, and it did focus on the changes that were necessary in connection with the addition of adults. to that regulation. Are there, yes, Ms. Chalupsky? No, I move it. Okay, do I have a second? Thank you, Ms. Kershaw. So it's been moved and second. Is there anyone who would like to discuss it? Hearing none. All those in favor, please raise your hand. All those opposed? Any abstentions? Brilliantly done, Dr. Lupini.
Thank you,
I
sir.
congratulate you.
Thank you.
We do have a discussion about the quarterly financial report, and I believe tonight that Mr. Rowe is going to help us with that.
Thank you very much. I'll wait for this to just come up here for a second. The broad overview of the second quarter report is that we're projecting really in the close to the same ballpark that we projected at the first quarter. You may recall that at the first quarter we were suggesting that spending for the year was expected to come in somewhere in the neighborhood of about $400,000 under budget for a number of reasons. So what we're seeing right now is about $335,000 under budget projection for FY14, and it's really driven by a number of interactive pieces, some of which include carry forward slightly under our salary projection, but the most significant piece really relates to special education costs, and particularly within that special ed contracted services where costs are down, and they're down significantly because of our ability to have returned students to in-house programs, as well as to have maintained students who might otherwise have gone out to private placements. So there's noticeable stability in both the student number and the cost growth. So that the programs that we've grown over the last couple of years have really allowed us to maintain those students. Additionally, our total salary projection is within this, in fact, under our budget by about $225,000. As you know, this year has been significant in that we've had increase in our enrollment, especially our enrollment at the elementary level. This is really the last year that we'll have stability at the high school. We are up slightly this year, but we'll begin our years of growth beginning next year. So this year's kindergarten class, which was down from a year ago, when you may remember we hit a record high at 630 students, is still at an historic high, meaning the second highest number that we've had in decades. And finally, and this really does relate to the issue of students going to private placement, we're projecting about $90,000 savings in our total transportation costs. So there's a connection between these two. When we send students out of district, the transportation cost is higher than keeping them in district. So we have both a program savings and a corresponding transportation savings when we can keep students in-house. So the numbers that you see, the two big ones are savings within personnel, where on a $73.4 million budget, we are coming in with a small but positive surplus of about $226,000 projected. And this is we think, fairly stable. Hopefully that will hold us through the end of the year. And then the services budget, most of this savings is from transportation. And that we're pretty confident that unless there were to be some unusual placement, that the number of route vehicles that we have in place will be able to keep us within this neighborhood of this number. The balance of the accounts are just about on budget. Our supplies are other and our capital. I will say two other things that are working in our favor. You may recall that we've based this year's budget on circuit breaker funding of $1.9 million. The final state budget actually funded that number at a higher rate, close to the full funding for this year of 75%. I think it's targeted at 72%. But the funding that we received a year ago, which is the funding that we will receive this year, based on last year's spending, which was higher than this year, will actually bring in about $2.1 million. So that the balance of that, we don't need to budget to the appropriation for this year, but we can allow that to roll into the circuit breaker fund balance, so that we can have some flexibility or contingency as we look forward to building next year's budget. The other piece that you may recall is that one savings that we took as we created this year's budget was moving certain staff from a federal grant back to the general fund and moving certain costs that were allowable onto the under the IDA grant, the Individual with Disabilities Act grant that serves our part of our special services population. So we're actually projecting some savings within that as well, so that as we move to the third quarter, we'll be able to fine-tune exactly the where we think we are with our total contracted services number. So in fact, the contracted services number that we're seeing here may actually grow in terms of some additional savings, so that overall we actually are able to present to you a relatively comfortable number that we believe will be able to use as a base for building next year's budget, meaning that we're going to come in under budget for the year, and that'll allow us to have a stable base, and we believe a comfortable number where we'll start building for FY15 from a lower threshold than what we have established for this year. And the reason that's very important is because you may recall we built this year's budget on $650,000 worth of with one-time money, if you will, circuit breaker money to supplement our spending. By finding ourselves at a spending threshold that's lower than the total, it means we'll really be able to roll this number back probably to somewhere in the 300,000 range as the base number of our spending when we then look forward to next year. So that rather than say we have to start from a position where we need to bring 650,000 to the table just to break even, we're actually going to find ourselves in a situation more like we need 300,000 to break even and then begin to look at what the plan is for next year. So the fact that we're doing better than budget has a significant, if you will, multi-year component to it. So we're hopeful that that'll help us as we begin to talk about next year. To just put some flesh on those numbers, you notice that our private placement numbers for this year, this is 69 students. We had been in the 80s for each of the last 4 years. And so while our spending is not down hugely, it is down significantly from a $7.2 million number 2 years ago. It still shows, you would say proportionally, if you lost that many students, would costs drop? Well, in fact, we still have some high cost placements. Unit prices go up each year, all those corresponding numbers. But the fact that we have been able to either keep in-house or bring back, and a significant number of these will bring back students from out-of-district placement, has really changed the trajectory of our spending pattern, which we've actually laid out in this fashion. This is, the dotted line is really what we would have been projecting had we not brought students back. And instead, we're in a much more stable pattern. And as we look forward to both next year and the year before, we hope that we can keep these numbers in this range rather than the trajectory and the slope that they would have been. So that's pretty important. The other piece that I think is important is we've looked at our numbers. I'll skip through these next two slides quickly because I know you can't read them. But there are two things to think about. One is the total number of students over the last 5 years that we're serving in our special education programs, and that's what this shows. And this is all students we serve, including what we call services only, which would be a student. They're frequently in early childhood programs, but not in our programs, but we serve them. Although there could be a student in a private school who's a Brookline resident who we serve as well as our out-of-district placements. And the other number we track is the, looking just at our system-wide K-8 student population. When you take the summaries of these two, what you actually see is that the 5-year pattern beginning in fiscal 10, which is October of 2009, first looking at the far right, which is just looking at our K-12, so that would be the in-house service population, where we moved up in fiscal 11 to just over 16% of our total population. While the numbers have grown of total students served over the last 4 years, you notice that as a percentage of our total population, we've actually see that percentage dropping very slowly through those 4 years. So that speaks to a lot of the actions that we've taken to build in-house programs, to staff as appropriately as we could for that full service population. And the same is really true when you look at district that more broadly at both preschool, which on a percentage basis, a higher percentage of students in pre-K have an education plan by definition, because we build our programs to serve all of those kids and then supplement with typically developing. So by definition, the percentage would go up. And also then this adds in the out-of-district placement. But you see a similar pattern, which is that after we peak in fiscal 11 on October 1, 2010, we have slowly brought that percentage down. One thing we have to continue to do is look at those numbers as we move through the year. But this shows a stability in our ability to provide service, and it speaks to a lot of the steps that we've taken in terms of management staff in place, evaluation team leaders at schools, building in-house programs, differentiating between learning centers and intensive learning centers, a host of actions that really we've taken over the last 5 years that we think are bearing fruit, both in terms of programmatic results and in terms of helping us to control some of our costs in special education. Yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, except we can dwell on all that good news that you've just given us. You have a number in the private placement costs 50/50 and circuit breaker for fiscal 14. We were talking about the number coming down to 69 students in out-of-district placements.
This one here, yeah.
But in the special education enrollment, fiscal 10 to fiscal 14?
Yeah, the number shows a different number.
61? Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
just curious what's
the reason for that is, you notice these are October 1 counts. You also notice if you look at the pre-K number, it says 47.
Right.
On October 1, the number in the preschool accounts, special ed students served was 47. By the time we got to the middle of December, it was, I believe, 85.
Okay.
You see a lot of students turning 3 during that period of time.
Point in time.
So while we generally try to use October 1 as our count for the year and put that kind of flag in the ground, the pattern within preschool is that count grows in the course of the year. The other thing in the way we report on private placements is there are some students who, let me see if I can get this right, they reflect in the count as substantially separate in some of our counts, but when we file our reports with Department of Education, they either do or don't get flagged as out of district. And so sometimes we get into that conversation. So we're paying tuitions for certain students. For instance, we may be in a settlement agreement where we've agreed to pay for a placement of a student. It doesn't count officially as an out-of-district placement in terms of the Department of Education, but it certainly counts in terms of our costs and what we say, this is our count here, we're paying for as a private placement, so we've historically included those. That's why you have some of these anomalies.
Thank you.
Yeah. And some of these are timing differences. We will, I can show you a similar report like this from March, and you'll see growth and movement in every one of these categories. And so when we look at it each year, that's why, in fact, we're beginning to look at this from a management standpoint on a much more regular basis than we once did. The percentage that you see here for the current year, I think tends to grow during the year. In other words, some students are identified, more seem to be identified in the course of the year than move off of a plan. And then at the end, in the end of the year, certain students will move off of a plan. You'll be at a lower threshold. You'll see that pattern inter-year as you move through. So some of this depends on the point in time. Last year, we did report to you on some March numbers. So we got our pre-K numbers right, if you will, and at the high number, but we also were reporting at numbers that varied from our sort of official count on October 1. So you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, no matter how you report them. Just quickly, this is the count of special education aides. We are, in fact, over our budgeted number. We're slightly over the number we had of actuals a year ago. We're still pretty close to the total number we had in '09 before we did the allocation of full-time kindergarten and full-time first grade. So we're still trying to maintain, while we are maintaining the count of the allocation of a full-time aide to every kindergarten and first grade, part of that is utilizing a resource that was once in a program model that was much more one-to-one than the program model we're using today. So we're still working hard to maintain that kind of staffing relationship. Just quickly, this is what our bars look like when we look at our enrollment. And I don't have to remind you of why we're worried about the future, because that enrollment, those blue and purple numbers are moving through the system, and it's that pressure that's putting pressure on our capacity. As you can see from the green bar, our average class size, while still favorable and close to where it was in the last couple of years, is still slightly up. And this is what we, as you know, struggle with annually as we put the budget together. When we look at the frequency of our average class size, you'll see that this year we have 50 occurrences of 22 students per class. And those red numbers show you how the, if you will, the normal curve has shifted to the right. So it's got a sort of right-hand shoulder to it, where when you look at the blue, if you will, distribution that we had in '05, it was much more of the normal curve, if you will. This is just quickly an outline of the total enrollment from '05 to the current year, which is growth of 1,342 students at our K-8 schools in that period of time. And finally, this is a layout of our appropriation, our spending, and what our spending pattern has been for the last 10 years, and our spending pattern within special education. You may recall we had about a $400,000 surplus at the end of last year. We're projecting in the $334,000 range this year. And when you look at where our total percentage growth is in our special education spending, those accounts that are directly in special education, you see that it's really due to some stabilization that's happened over here that's helped us in the broad budget. And that's significant, we think, from many of the investments that were made back 3-4 years ago are helping to bear fruit today. So that's helping us with our total budget. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Questions for Mr. Rowe? Ms. Ditkoff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always nice to get a little good news. Not much, but a little.
No. I mean, we
Tiny
caution, right, this is very small, $200,000, $400,000 on a $86 million budget is not a lot of wiggle room, but
way less than 1%.
But it's
There's a lot of good news.
It's what we want.
Little good news.
That's right.
It's the right direction anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's better, better than the alternative. So on page 4, I think one of the things that's most striking to people about this page is some math they have to do in their head, which is which is not just the count, but and I know this is hard, but almost the percent, right? Because I think that not only is the number going down, but the number compared to overall enrollment growth is going down.
Oh, sure.
So
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that people mathematically have to do in their head, and maybe it would be helpful if we could do this math for them and put it on the page, is have some sort of factor here for growth, because from '06 or pick a number, it doesn't matter. 06, I guess we've grown 35% in the K-8 since 06, and our number has gone down by an eighth. And so, anyway, I feel like people
No, I
are
get that.
doing that math in their head, so if we could do that math for them, I think it would be helpful.
I mean,
do some
right.
sort of factor.
Sure. I actually think it's even more effective to show it in dollars, which is essentially what this does.
Right, I
It
guess that-
shows where we would have been were we not able to hold the line.
Right, but that goes to 13, and I'm going back further.
Sure.
I'm actually saying if you started in 06 and tracked, and then you actually added up all the money in that gap over what is a 10-year savings number, it's a very different story. That's all. I just think that we're under expressing the magnitude of this. I think the second thing that I would add is on. I mean, I think that the other thing that would be really helpful somewhere right next to this slide is here are the investments we've made to try to capture that, right? So I think that you said them. I think it would be helpful to document them as more and more people see this slide. Because I think that we talk a fair amount about things like adding a kindergarten or a first grade para.
Right.
We talk about building in district programs. And so the question I get a lot, as you can imagine,
Right.
is
Adding
net-
evaluation team leaders, adding additional management staff to our special ed team, all of those are actions. And we talked about them before because they were in prior budget periods, but you're right.
But my
To
point-
make sure we review them and focus on the fact that we think it's those management changes that have really helped us.
That's right. So I guess what
programs.
precisely, to say that, there are a few guiding principles that we have about inclusion, about bringing kids back into the district, there are educational principles we have. And over a multi-year period, we have been enacting things that we think get us closer and closer to that educational vision that we have. In addition, those investments, which cost X amount of money over time, have yielded Y amount of financial savings in addition to the educational benefit. So I just feel like pulling that story together is actually really important. And I think what happens is that because we tell it piecemeal, people don't necessarily get it. So I'll just stop there. I guess the last thing I would say is that on page 9 also, it would just be helpful to understand this as a percent of the, relative to population growth, I guess is what I would say. Because again, it looks like we're going from, 167 to 174 to 154 to, and to up to 170, and it's just hard to contextualize those numbers without understanding the growth.
188 on an elementary, this is primarily elementary population, which in '09 would have been smaller than today. The 195 is fewer aides per student. You're right, when you do that.
That's my point. And I feel like there are ways that we could sharpen this a little, and I would be very grateful if we could do that.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments for Mr. Rowe? Maybe just for the public, Mr. Rowe, I'll say that while the budget we show is $86 million, there are substantial other funds which the town accounts for on our behalf, so that the total cost of the school is up in the, $120 million range?
That's correct, yes.
Well, hold on one second.
Yes. You're right. The answer is we budget on the town side our benefits.
Right.
Our building services, much of our snow and ice removal. There are a host of services that are carried on the town side. So there's about a $40 million worth of services for schools that are carried outside of our operating budget.
Right.
To your point, yeah.
That's not a negative comment.
No, the comment I want to make, at the risk of this becoming just a refrain at every meeting that I'm at, is that that is a number that has not been audited historically. One of the great things about Brookline is that's a number that we've just submitted as part of the submission that goes into the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Quite frankly, no one's paid attention to it because no one held us all accountable for it. Right. And what I said at one of the Override Study Committee subcommittee meetings is that if we were going to now begin to actually use that as a real number, then we were going to audit it. Mm-hmm. And we're going to pay attention to what's actually in there right? What services from the town's in there, what positions from the town are in there, to what percentage they're in there, and let's have a conversation about that. And I think
Right.
some members of the advisory committee agree with that, and I'm certainly sure that some members of the override study committee agree with that.
Right.
And just one tiny little bit, which is that since those it's town-owned property, many of those costs would be incurred regardless of whether or not there was a school on that property.
Yes.
For example, you would still need to plow a sidewalk, whether or not there was a school on that piece of property. And so if the discussion is far more complicated than should it be charged against the
Oh, yes,
schools
yes,
or
yes.
not, because it may or may not be because there's a school on that piece of land. So I don't know if anybody actually wants to get into that conversation, but it is a complicated.
No, I would be horrified if my comments resulted in that. I just wanted to give the public who may not realize it that there are substantial additional costs.
I'm certainly planning to attribute it to your comments, so.
That's fine. Always a pleasure.
So thank you. So let me talk with you tonight about where we are with the FY 2015 budget. We're calling this an outline of that budget. In particular, we're going to spend probably most of our time this evening on what we've been working on in terms of a one-year slice of technology. What we'll call catch-up. I don't love that word either. But in terms of where we've fallen behind in the overall plan that we've been putting in place for a number of years, and some steps that we've taken in terms of what we're putting forward for discussion here to catch up on that, to make some movement, to make up for what's been lost, what's been taken in terms of our budget over time by our increased enrollment, just as it's taken away from guidance counselors and those kinds of things. And while I certainly want to thank, I do want to thank Dr. Fisher-Mueller, Mr. Moore for their amazing work on what's gone before the Override Study Committee so far, and their work to take this and boil it down to this one-year sort of slice of where we absolutely need to be in terms of technology. I also want to thank Mr. Stokes, who's actually here this evening, for his work with all of us, including some time he spent with me the other day, time he spent with the Deputy Town Administrator to take this piece and make sure that it was something that he was supportive of and that we were able to put in place in terms of looking at FY15 and how we could make some inroads into what I'll characterize a number of times this morning as a simply inequitable situation for our students and staff. So I want to start tonight by by sharing something that Rob Evans said today. Some of you know Rob Evans. He does a number of does some work with school committee members, with principals, superintendents, and Rob was our presenter today. And Rob said this. I can't remember. Maybe someone can remind me where Rob said this came from. But Rob said today that a vision without resources is a hallucination. And I liked that and thought maybe it belonged actually here. So, pardon? The Navy. Okay, that's a good, okay, we'll attribute it there. Great. So let me take you through some of what we're working on now in terms of the budget and use the categories we've been talking about. So this is the one where we're probably the surest right now, if indeed our assumption of 630 new kindergartners is accurate. We believe there's a need for 3 elementary classroom teachers, K to 5. We believe there's a need for 4 grades 6 through 8 teachers. What you'll see in the presentation in a week and a half is that that's obviously a little sloppier in application because those are FTEs across school in some particular subject areas, those kinds of things. There's a need for 2.9 elementary and middle grade specialists. This includes not only art, music, physical education, but the elementary world language and indeed the middle level language program. And this is the first year you've seen us talking about high school teachers associated with growth. Okay, this is straight out of, right now for the moment, straight out of the presentation we made in October that shows an increase of some number of students. I believe it's in the 75 to 80 range at the high school, which is associated with the number of classes that we need to offer. We don't know what areas. We won't know till they schedule, which is a process that's starting. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.2 FTE. So this is that million you'll see it associated with later on that pays for classroom teachers associated with our growth. So the area that we're a little less sure of, but we've been having conversations about where are we going to, out of all of these areas where we know we're behind, all these classroom support areas where we know we need to provide resources to support our students and to support the number of students that we have in the system. What are those areas? And most particularly, what are the areas that we've honed in on in terms of our conversation? That does not mean that these are the areas that you will see necessarily in the presentation a week and a half from now, but this is where our conversation lies right now. So obvious, because we've spent a lot of time on this in the classroom support piece of this budget. It's in psychologist and guidance, the guidance area. We know, because you've seen in that presentation in October, that we are woefully short in guidance counselors across our school in terms of the ratios of those counselors to students. You will see a continuation of our efforts in literacy. That is an adding of schools and or grade levels to the literacy collaborative work. Some FTE in nursing, particularly focused on those areas where the shortfall in the FTEs is most egregious. There's a need to add the principal that we've talked about here tonight at the old Lincoln School. There's a need to add vice principal support at our two largest schools, Pierce and Baker School. Our second and third largest schools. We already have added a second VP position at Devotion, but there's a need to add some FTE at Baker and at Pierce. Middle level performing arts is an area that we talked about last year in terms of being able to offer an equitable conservatory program across all of our schools. There's a certain FTE that needs to be offered so that all students have the same opportunity in terms of chorus and in terms of band and in terms of guitar and in terms of the music production that we've spent so much time talking about. Those are simply not available to all of our students now, and they need to be. Supplies, we're looking at a modest increase to supply budgets which have not moved in what number of years? I'm sorry, I should know this.
They've only been added to very incrementally in recent years.
Right. High school security, we are looking at the model that we presently utilize in terms of high school security and are looking at proposing some changes to that. You may know that now it's a paraprofessional model, and we're looking at whether that would continue to be the model or whether there'll be some others. And then there may be some increase here in math specialists. That essentially frames what will be in this package in terms of classroom supports, and specifics to come on the 11th. In special education, we have a second year of our language-based program at Brookline High School. You will remember last year that we put this program into place for 9th grade students, 8 9th grade students who were coming to the high school. There's a cohort of students now advancing from 8th grade, another significant group. This program has been terribly successful in terms of providing a quality experience for students and in terms of keeping students at Brookline High School. And we want to make sure we mirror our ability to do that for those 9th graders while providing a program for those other students as they advance to 10th grade. There will be some recommendations in terms of speech and language, in terms of inclusion teachers, particularly focused at the middle level to support those students who are in our comprehensive learning centers and for whom they do not necessarily right now receive as much time with a certified teacher in an academic area that they need to. And so the goal here is to make sure they have that experience. We have a terrific social and emotional support program housed at the Devotion School, and we need some types of services to support those students at Brookline High School. There's need for employment and community resource specialist work in terms of primarily our special education students program at Brookline High School. Learning center teachers, there's I believe one FTE that we'll be building in one of our elementary schools. And we believe we need another BCBA position to support those efforts. And again, this is the list we're working with now. The reason you don't see FTEs, the reason, as you do in this first chart, is we're simply not there yet. We're simply not there on this list. We're simply not there on this list right now. So areas that we continue to focus on in terms of providing what I'll call better service, some people want to call that efficiencies, that'll be great, revolve around the rental of spaces, our scheduling of buildings. We believe that to do a better job in terms of some ideas that may come out in policy revolving around the rental of space, we need to be better at scheduling those spaces. That is, we need to be better at renting them and how we go about scheduling. And you'll hear me say for the first time, I think 3 times in this particular chart, that means we believe centralizing those functions. We also believe we need to centralize our registrar functions, our residency functions at the elementary level. Whether that means combining that function with the high school functions, we're not there yet. But certainly it means centralizing registration for parents, probably within that parent center idea. And the fee collection, no matter what fees it may be, right now they're handled in the particular department. Athletic fees are collected in athletics. Early education fees are collected there. We believe that all of those fee collections could benefit by being centralized. So that brings me to this proposal in terms of the classroom support, the catch-up. You pick the word in terms of technology. A couple things before I say anything here. So I spent a considerable amount of time with a really amazing colleague of mine who's the superintendent in Burlington the last day or so, where they are viewed as a leader in this area in terms of what they've put in place in terms of a one-to-one initiative. They're a leader in PARC right now. I think all of us are benefiting from some work they're doing. They've adopted PARC district-wide this year, and as Eric likes to tell anyone, we're just going to see how much of it we can really mess up so that we can tell everyone how this works when we try devices with everyone, different types of devices. They've done such amazing work and been willing to share areas where they've not succeeded and areas of celebration. And Eric shared 2 things with me that I want to, 1 or 2 things that I want to say tonight. The first is that when asked in his community, why are we doing this? Why are we spending what we're spending here? Why this ask? Eric responds very simply, you know, there was a time when I'll bet we had those conversations around textbooks. There may have even been a time when we had those conversations about power outlets in the walls, right? We're at a point where this is a tool of learning for students. And it's a tool of being able to use information and share information for professionals. And we need to provide that, or as Alan November says, and I think you heard him say, and I've certainly quoted him as saying, he was involved in a presentation for a group, board of a private school in Virginia, and knew that walking in they were looking at this initiative and that many people were not necessarily in favor of it on the board. And he said, I want you to write down everything that you're afraid of. Everything that you're afraid of about the technology that we're talking about. And he collected them, and they talked about them for a little while. And he said, well, here's what I want to say to you. If you don't do this, everything on these cards will come true. All your fears about what students will do in terms of finding papers and plagiarism, all those things that you're saying, they will all absolutely happen, I can guarantee it. If we put programs in place in terms of literacy around the use of the devices, if we use them as a tool in learning, you know, we have a chance to be able to talk intelligently with students and our staff about those things. And then Eric said, and the more practical piece is he says to his boards, his groups, he says, so X number of the top colleges in the country are using an XYZ platform. And there are students in schools, and I was really pleased that Eric pointed to Beverly. There are schools like Beverly where students have been getting that experience for 4 years. And they walk into those places, and I can tell you from experience they do. They walk into those places ready to handle that type of learning environment, ready to handle those kinds of experiences. And some of our students do. Some of our students do. But not all. Not those that don't have their own devices or their own access, right? They don't. And that's not right, and it's not Brookline, and it's not equitable. And so the other thing I'll say before going through the details of this is this plan won't, this 1-year plan won't do that. It's not meant to. It's merely meant to make sure that we can provide more equitable access than we have now. And if you've looked at the slides that I gave you to go along with this document, you can see that, right? A couple weeks ago in a newspaper, there was a highlight of the Newton technology, and in that article, it said a number of things, but one of the things is it said is a lack of a plan ensures an inequitable distribution of technology. A plan that's based on PTOs and outside funders ensures inequity among your schools. And it talked about Newton and how they have that. Well, guess what? So do we. So do we. And so what we've tried to point out here is that we have an opportunity, we, the town of Brookline, we, the public schools of Brookline, have an opportunity to do something about that in FY15. At a total investment of the $400,000 that's been set aside in the CIP and the $637,000 that we've worked with Mr. Stokes on. We have an opportunity to do something about that, and we need to. So the pieces of this include the addition for $200,000 of 600 computers on a 4-year life cycle to address what I showed you back here. One thing I want to point out so that we don't get caught talking about these things later on is in some of the, well, I'll go on to the other one later on, is that this is our data, and it shows ratios at Heath, it shows the ratios at Pierce has the widest discrepancy, and shows what will happen with those 400 computers that we would add at the elementary level and how it closes that gap of accessibility. Where am I? I'm here. Yeah, there are 400 devices at the elementary level, 200 devices at Brookline High School in FY15. So another an increase of $244,000 to the $356,000, which, if I'm correct, is the amount or slightly above it authorized in a prior override, right? So that $356,000 is essentially the amount of money that has been the Brookline technology budget since the 96,
was it?
Override.
I think we actually added 100,000
Right.
to it at one point.
Right.
But yes, you're right.
That's it.
It's primarily from the override.
And so, surprise, surprise, what was a 4-year replacement cycle has turned into a +5 replacement cycle for the computers on our carts, for the computers that are in our teachers' hands. It's gotten worse because the budget hasn't moved, and you may have noticed we've increased the numbers of students and staff. But for $244,000, we can take that back to a 5-year replacement, or excuse me, a 4-year replacement cycle. In assistive technology, this is an area that I want to applaud. By the way, as a parent and as a superintendent, I want to applaud the efforts of our staff, particularly Karen Schmuckler, and there are many others associated with this. But this is not a district, and I take this as a parent of a child who derives benefit from assistive technology. This is not a district that had done terrific work in this area of providing the tools, providing the counseling to teachers around those tools for students with certain special needs. we have, through a small budget of $45,000, essentially use outside consultant services for 2 days a week of assistive technology work, and we believe we can add another day and a half to that for $37,500, which is sorely needed by our teachers and our students in making sure that they have the tools that they need to access our curriculum. Here, we presently have a budget in teaching and learning tools that supports Canvas at Brookline High School and supports Virtual High School. You know that. We've talked often about Virtual High School. For another $10,000 here, we're able to add some student technology assessment tools, staff technology assessment tools, in terms of helping us help teachers to develop the skills that they need in order to work with our students. I think what's really important here is what we're not doing. I mean, we believe, our teachers, and our teachers believe, are ready, at least at the grade 7 and 8 level, to use Canvas or use some sort of learning management system. That's not proposed here. There are no enhancements here. This is essentially keeping up with some of the things that we've tried to do over the last number of years. Here, in student digital content, we're proposing an increase of $32,000. It's slightly misleading in that Scott Moore presently robs the library budget of $13,000 a year to provide some digital content. And what we're suggesting here is that we can replace that 13 and still provide him with a budget for providing apps, certain programs like the ones that you see listed here, including some college test prep and student career prep materials. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yep.
When you talk about a learning management system,
Yep.
That's between teachers and students or between teachers and parents? What is the community that benefits from that learning management system?
Yeah, right. So it's generally speaking, as we've applied it, teachers and students. There are parent applications that can be utilized.
That are part of that.
Yes.
So it's part of part of our bridge work, essentially,
Yes.
in terms of communications between home and school.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
And again, being in that district, I have access to many of those kinds of things for my children.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that a learning management tool is not simply something we're providing to teachers. It's something that's about
it's about
the
communicating with
integration
students.
of, right.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. So here, essentially, this represents an increase for administrative tools of about $18,000. Last year, Mr. Cronin, we appreciate that he supported our implementation of TeachPoint from the Capital Improvement Plan, from the CIP. That's not in next year's CIP, so there's a need to absorb $20,000 somewhere that will support our work in educator evaluation, our work of an app, of a program. And then there are additional dollars in here for, let's see, an IT management tool, and funds to support the needed help desk supplies given an increase in inventory. Network infrastructure, this is the area in particular that I want to thank Mr. Stokes for, because we've had a number of conversations. You'll find an amount of money in here for network infrastructure within the operating budget. You'll also find within the CIP for the switches, servers, all those things that make sure that the network runs. Mr. Stokes has also made some commitments in terms of the bandwidth that will be available in our schools, for our schools come July 1st, and we appreciate his efforts to purchase more bandwidth with similar budget dollars, and the work he's done in that area. So that's it. That's a $637,000. Again, as Mr. Cronin maybe accounts for it, it may be $637 less $75,000 because that goes into Mr. Stokes' budget. That's the package in terms of the operating budget that we believe is nothing more than a simple equity package in terms of providing for our students. In terms of the capital improvement plan, again, Mr. Cronin's very careful in terms of what he wants to see us talk about in terms of the capital improvement plan versus the operating. We worked hard with him around some of these issues that we wanted to make sure were part of this plan, and what would fit in terms of the capital plan. They include the carts themselves for storage of those computers that will be in schools under the earlier element of this plan. It includes mobile projection. I mean, this could make its own chart itself. We have 71 classrooms in this district that have mounted projection. 44 of them are at Runkle. We all know why. They were part of a building project. 7 of them are at Heath. We all know why. They were part of a building project. 20 are at Devotion. They were paid for by the PTO. And 3, I believe it is the number, are at the high school. We've proposed here an additional 46 classrooms that would receive mounted projection between the elementary and the high school under this plan, and ensure that we continue our move toward providing every classroom with that basic of mounted projection, and every grade spans with carts of computers, et cetera. And then there's an additional amount of dollars here for network infrastructure, which essentially establishes a budget for Mr. Stokes for school-related infrastructure of in the neighborhood of $150,000 between the capital improvement plan and the. So I've shown you this chart. We've taken a look at this. One thing to remember here is this is just to be sure we're being completely transparent with everyone. This is a comparison of Brookline FY14 to other communities' FY12 numbers. I'm told that's the last year that these data are available, and that's the comparison that Mr. Moore made. But I think you'll agree it's striking in terms of where Brookline stands in terms of all of the computers available, all the computers available in the district. So that is an apples to apples. This is all the computers available in the district divided by the number of students. And where we stand, and in FY12, where a number of other districts that I think we like to compare ourselves to stood in this same measure, and where we stand under the plan that we've put forward for the FY15 budget. That's what it would do to our number in that 1 year. You have something you want to say about the rest of this in terms of some numbers? Sure. Okay.
So where we are in terms of budget development, so if you take the initiatives that Bill has laid out here, first let me talk a little bit about where we are with the town in discussion around revenue. The town school partnership number based on traditional practice, including a $1 million appropriation split between town and schools for enrollment growth, would yield just over $3 million for FY15. The conversation that we've been having, partly through the Overage Study Committee, but then with the town administration, is that there hopefully will be a movement through the spring to work to increase parking fees in the neighborhood of 25 cents an hour townwide, which would yield a package with some other adjustments in terms of parking meters across the system of about $1 million, all of which would be committed to the school budget. We're also looking at issues of charging new fees for the use of school facilities that we haven't done in the past, that we think could yield somewhere in the neighborhood of $120,000 for the year. This would be new revenue. And then the continuation of our materials fee program with the growth that we would anticipate for next year would bring in somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000. So that the package of total revenue that we're looking at is in the neighborhood of $4.2 million. The broad expenditure challenges that we face for next year include somewhere in the neighborhood of a $500,000 growth for special education services. We need to make sure that we've provided enough of a contingency for the pressure that can happen in our private placements, even though our numbers are under control. As you know, that there can be variability from year to year, and there can be some very high cost issues, so we have to watch that closely. And in addition, As the superintendent documented, we have a significant number of areas of in-house growth that we want to put resources to address areas of need that we believe we've fallen behind over the last few years. We'll need to fund the net increase of step increases, which are probably next year going to be in the neighborhood of $1.2 million, and the net increase after offsetting for retirements and other turnover, we're currently estimating in the neighborhood of $750,000. For regular education program supports, the superintendent has set a goal of $800,000 allocated to that. We have some other changes in our grant areas where we believe we'll have reductions, or simply a level funded appropriation example would be the METCO grant for next year, where the governor's budget has level funded that. That'll put pressure on us to maintain service levels, so we may need to allocate as much as $150,000 to grant and other contingencies. Additionally, we have collective bargaining unknown for next year, but if we set aside funding for 1% increase plus the tail of the current collective bargaining agreement, we're in the neighborhood of $1.4 million in terms of next year's cost. The enrollment growth number that was the first slide, addressing the 7 sections at the elementary school, the 5.2 sections at the high school, and the specials that we believe we'll need to fund, including the world language adjustments, will cost us in the neighborhood of $1 million. And finally, the detail that the superintendent just reviewed, which is the $637,000 technology plan, so that those as a total package come out to $5.3 million. I wish it was 3.5. $5.3 million, so that we are really looking at a shortfall in the neighborhood of $1.1 million as we stand here today, given all that pressure. So we're still working on the question of what can we include, what do we need to take out. One area of opportunity was something I mentioned in the third quarter report, which is, let me try the second quarter report, it's getting late, which is that we do believe that we're going to end this year at a lower spending threshold than our original budget. Because of that, it gives us an opportunity with some of the reserves that we have set aside to look at what level and how we might bring some of those resources to bear to deal with some of this gap. And then we'll have to sharpen our pencils around what are the other areas where we may or may not be able to make initiatives. So we don't know whether this will truly work out to be a bridge budget or at what level it'll be an acceptable level of service. But so we're working to close this gap, and this is what the challenge is in front of us.
So let me say 2 more things, Mr. Morris, and then I'm happy to try to answer questions. Again, Mr. Stokes is here as well. So as Ms. Ditkoff laid out earlier, last year's bridge was about classroom teachers, right? It was about classroom teachers. I said then, and have said consistently through the fall, that we could not do that again. This year's bridge needed to be, at least in part, about some supports that have been neglected for the number of years that we've tried to keep up with our growing enrollment. Here they are. Many of them are on this list. There are some other issues where we have initiatives on this list as well, but here are a number of those. We also have not accounted for some changes in special education programming that need to be made in order to keep up with the data that Mr. Rowe showed you earlier. That's how it's been created. I simply must, whether I have additional funds through some other allocation, through our own reserves or whatever, I simply must commit some of them to a number of these areas. I do not want to be in the position standing here in 2 weeks of doing that while proposing cuts in other areas. That's not where we want to be in terms of a bridge, in terms of the ongoing conversation. So that's point one. Point two is I am happy to stand at this podium with the Override Study Committee and discuss technology. I am happy to bring members of this team up to stand here and discuss technology, to discuss the long-term vision, what we might look like in terms of a bring your own device program, the other kinds of things that need to be in place. This is not that night. Tonight is a simple equity issue about what we're able to provide in our schools, given the program that we've been trying to put into place, given the support that we've received and appreciated from our PTOs and other organizations, but that has helped create this and what you saw in terms of projection, and that we simply, as a town and system, must stop. We believe, Mr. Stokes and I had a great conversation, Dr. Fisher-Mueller and I have had a great conversation. We've had terrific conversation with our parents about the appropriate role for PTO dollars in plans. It is around innovation. It is around helping teachers do interesting and creative things and then share them with their colleagues in an effort to spark interest and spark those kinds of practices across the system. It is in professional development. It is not in creating that. This is a simple plan that begins to remedy that and nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lupini. Clearly presented, clear message. Comments or questions? Clear? Right. Yes, Ms. Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Lupini. So here it says our total average ratio is 6.14, and in the slide that looks across districts,
Yes.
it is considerably lower than that.
Yes. This is, so there are two different, this is all, you're talking about this one? These slides?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is, as I understand it, this is all computers, including administration, right? And this is what's available in terms of students on carts in classrooms, those kinds of things. So they are indeed two different numbers.
Okay.
Right, it does not have the high school, that's correct.
Oh, this is just elementary.
That's just elementary schools,
Okay.
right.
Thank you for, thank you.
Other questions?
Oh, I did have one more piece on the technology, sorry. I understand and certainly support the notion of dramatically increasing, although not reaching our goals in terms of the computers per student. I wonder where in this, if anywhere, there is also some kind of forward motion on the access at home?
Not that I can speak to tonight, although remember we do have some dollars budgeted that we did not move forward on in terms of last year. We anticipate that'll roll over into next year in terms of beginning to address that kind of technology for students who don't have access. There are some things I want to talk to Mr. Stokes about in terms of the support for either wireless or that kind of thing in homes that they're doing in Burlington that I think might interest him, where they're actually using some of their capacity at the school level in the evening to support those kinds of efforts, and I'm wondering whether we might do that. So
that would be great. I was very concerned to see recently that that in the public housing buildings there are computer centers with desktop computers. Presumably they don't operate 24/7, and the supports that might need to be there aren't there. But that in the apartments themselves there is.
Yes, the piece of this I've not tested yet, and we've not done anything with here because it's in existing budget, is we do have some capacity here to be able to provide at the high school level, as we discussed last year, some number based on the results of the survey. I think we're doing this week yet. Great, that we're doing next week to make sure we can provide a hard number for people around what is the access that students have. What's the access that our students have to a one-to-one device that they can bring to school every day and utilize. When we get those numbers, and we'll have them next week, then begin to craft a plan to support those students who don't have that kind of access with some existing budget dollars.
I mean, I am certain we're going to find that it is not. I think most people assume that it's mostly going to be kids who are low-income kids and perhaps in public housing, but I suspect we will find a great many students in families where there is just one shared computer in a family that cannot leave the home.
I agree with you.
So be eager to see those numbers.
Ms. Kershaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to reiterate, I've said it before, I'm very, very, very glad we're having this conversation and that we're doing the work to lay out the long-term vision and going to bat for it. And I think it's exactly the right conversation to have. So it's a question, but also a statement, I think, as we go and advocate for this and how important it is. I think it's important that we're really articulating the impact we anticipate on student achievement. And I feel like we've had a little bit of that conversation here, but I wonder if there's something you want to add about how we might easily and quickly articulate that at a time when people might feel a tension between taxes and teachers and computers.
Right. I'm going to ask for a week on that. That'll be part of our message. We're actually working on that. Began to do that this week so that we could best articulate that in the document and in our presentations.
Ms. Ditkoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on that, I mean, I think what's very challenging for people who've been having this conversation for many, many months is, and years, is a couple of things. I mean, one is, as we think about there's a deep conflict between on the one hand, being, first of all, incredibly appreciative of all the hard work that got us to these slides and this presentation and all of the discussions that had to go into it, and yet it's a bare bones plumbing, not even getting us to equity budget, right? So so forget about enhancement, right? This is bare bones plumbing, not even barely getting us to equity.
Right.
And having to be appreciative of that. I think at the same time, when we ask people when we hear from people in this town what type of education they expect for their children, we hear words like, we want to see educational vision. We want to see educational innovation. We want to see Brookline being on the leading edge of educational different ways to think. And none of this is about computers replacing teachers. It's always in the context of that teacher relationship. But I think this community has incredibly high expectations for the education of the children, and in particular, things like innovation and technology, given that so many people in this community happen to be leaders in education technology on the national stage. There are many people in this community who are professors at MIT, who are working with Google on innovative devices, who, not everyone obviously, but it's extraordinary the gap between, and this presentation only brings that into starker relief. The gap between what we are funding, what we are proposing, what we are in a position to fund and propose, and I think what our aspiration is. And so to some extent people are saying, oh, well, make sure you don't build a Cadillac. This is not even a Yugo. And so I just want to be really, really clear about that, because, and I say this with so much respect for all of the work that went into it, but honestly, this is not exciting, right? This is not innovative. This is not equity. It's not a position of educational leadership, and I don't think any one of you would say it is. And so it's just I feel very deeply conflicted about even saying that I support this, which I think is probably the way you feel also, and I'm not quite sure how to make sure that gets across, because I think what this community is asking for and demanding is educational excellence and innovation, as well they should be, as am I as a parent, and this is so not that. It's not just not that, it is so not that. And so
So,
Well, it's a step, right, but it's, so yes, it's a step. And I guess when I think about student achievement and I think about all the questions that people are asking us and I'm asking us about what that means, that this doesn't.
so I do
I'm
believe
speechless.
it's nothing other.
Made me speechless.
I do believe it's nothing other than a minor step. As I said, I'm happy to have that conversation. We're going to drop back. We're going to have that conversation about the plan. We'll come forward with something that people already had called not terribly visionary, right? In terms of what we had out there before, and I think we were the first to admit it was not, right? But I believe it provides the basic backbone to do that, and we need to do that, and I can't allow myself to look at what I want to be able to do, what I want to put in front of this committee, the Board of Selectmen, the Override Study Committee for discussion 2 and 3 and 4 years out. Right now, I can't let that get in the way of what I can do in FY15.
Which is exactly what we've asked of
Right.
you and Dr. Fisher
Right.
Miller and Scott and
Right.
Peter and Kevin and everyone. So
This is what we can do in FY15, and we need to do it.
we just need to be clear about what it isn't.
Right.
Okay.
It isn't a lot.
Yeah, so I just want to take a prerogative to reinforce what Ms. Ditkoff, I usually wait until everybody else is done, but I think I'd like to reinforce what Ms. Ditkoff just said, because I understand that you've done a really wonderful job in getting this far, but probably consistent with the comments I made at the public hearing, I'm fearful, through no fault of anyone here, that this is a possible risk in terms of step backward in terms of quality long term. Maybe we can recover with a successful override, but it's risky business, and I'm concerned for Brookline education. Having nothing at all to do, I'll just repeat again, for what you've been able to construct here.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I don't know what the alternative is.
That's what I'm trying to say. I understand that we don't have
Right.
an alternative.
Right, so the alternative is not to do this.
That's
because
right.
then teachers and students are in those conditions with equipment that's a year older, right? Without the ability to do some of the basics of the classroom for at least one more year.
Right. And that's why I'm just saying, I'm reiterating what Ms. Ditkoff said to make sure that the public is not, doesn't get the wrong impression about what this might do. I'm sorry. I apologize to my colleagues for taking that prerogative. Ms. Gatto.
I have to agree with both Mr. Morse and Ms. Ditkoff. I think we have been behind in technology for years. The reason our school system remains as good as it is the quality of the people who work here.
Right.
And they're not going to continue to work here if we don't bring our technology up to the level that we are taking a baby step toward at this point. But to go to my question, and you can well imagine it's about the library budget. I was glad to see
I'm
here-
shocked.
Well, I was at ALA all last week. I've been with librarians for a week, so I have to ask this. You would ask it anyway. I would ask it anyway. That's true. I very much support the digital content that we are bringing into the system. I think that's quite important. And I am glad that we have a $32,000 increase. I am wondering about the library budget, because the $13,000 was taken from the library budget last year. Is the library budget this year at the level it was before the $13,000 was taken? Is it going to be increased, or is it at a lower level?
Well, it's not at a lower level. It's at least at the level it was before that $13,000 was removed. We haven't discussed an increase, but we haven't discussed a number of those areas yet in terms of what happens with those supply
Right.
numbers or what happens with other dollars that we may put in. But I can tell you that it's at least at the level of this year's budget plus that amount that was taken. Can I just say, I mean, one of the great things for me in getting involved more in this directly on early this week was just an appreciation of what Scott and Kevin have done in terms of trying to provide some supports, right? But quite frankly, by borrowing dollars from other areas. I mean, trying to provide, for example, supports for computers where we have an increasing teaching by taking away from student inventories, right? Taking away from the library in order to start a digital resource. Instead of us Kevin, in the discussions the other day, I'm still amazed at what Kevin's been able to do in this infrastructure area by essentially taking a little bit from this part of his budget and a little bit of that part of his budget, instead of having an amount of money that says, this is the amount of money I have to spend each year on the schools and their infrastructure. That's the other piece that we're trying to do here, is establish budgets and say, now we're back to some number. It may not be enough. It's some number. And let's make sure we preserve that and talk about what we do with it in the future. But they've done amazing. It's amazing to me that based on the budgets available, based on that little bit of work I was able to do this week, it's amazing to me that they've been able to do what we've been able to do, which is not satisfactory to your point.
Right. And the reason I keep bringing up the libraries, because I agree with you completely, but when you have elementary school libraries with circulations of 25 to 35,000 books a year, with an increasing school population, you have to put money into the basic books as well as the digital. So
yes.
I'm not expecting that we can do it. I just keep reminding people that it's something we need to think about in the future.
I've heard you say that before.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to be.
No, don't be sorry.
Ms. Cox, you wanted to say something, I believe.
It's something, and again, I think we've talked before about professional development being a big piece, and it's really what teachers will do with these things in their classrooms that's going to make the most enormous difference, and it's going to be the most visionary and powerful stuff that we can do with technology, and having some kids in a school that maybe has had the introduction of some of that technology, I've gotten to see that.
Yep.
That teachers will do interesting and dynamic things, but particularly when they get the training to go with it. So I expect there'll be some piece about professional development down the line. Yes. And then a very mundane question. Under teaching and learning tools, what are student technology assessment tools and staff technology assessment tool?
You'll see in there that there is a curriculum for student research and technology literacy. And then the assessment tools are actually the tests of those skills named in that curriculum.
Right. Where do I see that? Or
is that not, it's a teaching and learning tool, may I go?
I don't think I have that document in there.
All right, I've got it in front of me. Let me just grab mine.
Yep, sure.
Document up here. I apologize. Different versions. I want to be sure I get the right one here. Okay.
Nothing to apologize about, Mr. Fisher-Mueller. We didn't give you any warning whatsoever, for goodness sakes.
We'll probably see it another time. Yeah, don't worry about it. I was just curious.
Major things that were left out. We don't, not line by line, but just what were some of the big things that got left on the cutting floor?
Major things that were left out. Yeah, sure. You want,
Yes.
you ready? Or
So I'm trying to,
Yeah.
I'm still.
Let me speak to these two. Stay here in case you want to add. So I believe there were two areas that were in some of the original work that was done that we talked about this week. One I referenced earlier, and that was that piece on innovation, dollars for innovation, because we believe, and we've discussed with parent leaders, and they're very enthusiastic about this. The idea of that being an appropriate place for them to place dollars. The other is the issue that we've agreed to come back on, and that's the area of staffing. Anything associated with staffing, how we do help desk, how we do support in buildings. We believe that we have a conversation to have both with Mr. Cronin, Mr. Stokes, Mr. Rowe, myself, others. Who need to be involved in that conversation of what does that organization look like. There are some systems that have set out to move in this direction that have structured that in a certain way. We need to take a look at them, figure out what those positions are. Are some of them contracted out? Are they employees? We need to take a look at all those pieces. So what we did is we took anything associated with that area, we sat it over here and said, need to come back to that this spring to have that conversation, both in terms of our existing staff and in terms of steps we might take down the road. Yes, not teacher PD, but yes, teacher PD coach type people, yes. The answer is yes.
Just to put down a marker, I mean, I think that just speaks to the professional development angle of what will teachers do with this. And so,
yeah.
I understand that staff is a bit of a lightning rod.
Well, one of the goals, so specifically in terms of those discussions, we had tried to increase some of that tech support at the building level in order to take our ETSs, free them up, so that they could do more of that coaching, modeling role. That's happening in some buildings, whereas in other buildings, the people are doing much more work with technical support for teachers. We're going to need, that's going to need to be part of that examination. So those are the two most prominent areas.
Other questions?
You may.
Go back to that. So I believe if you look at your document where it says the teaching and learning tools, all right, the 10,650, the explanation, teaching and learning tools of highest priority are research and information literacy curriculum, student technology assessment tools, all right, meaning that that's the test of that curriculum that we're naming. And then the staff technology assessment tool is that testing of and reporting of teachers on their skills of technology. Does that make sense, Ms. Cox?
I just wasn't sure.
Yeah. And if I can just for a second go to some of the bigger things that were left out. The analytics dashboard software to provide that data in a very handy way for principals and teachers as we, excuse me? Yes, thank you, student achievement data, as we engage in more formative assessments to better individualize student learning, to make that data available. Curriculum management software, which also supports the identification of specific skills and content and supports the interdisciplinary connections around that curriculum. Inventory management software, PD management tool, and also online professional development. Support that you mentioned earlier, portfolio management tool, and that I feel actually very strongly about this portfolio management tool. It doesn't sound that exciting, but what it would allow us to do is not only for students, but also for teachers, it's the gathering of your learning and evidence of your learning over time. And that's a very powerful tool for kids to come to own their learning better, to understand what it is they're working on, to set goals, to communicate that learning with parents. And also then the video. Video is a very large part of digital learning that is advancing, and it's a significant part of the burn-up, if you will, of that bandwidth. And that's an area that Alan November speaks very passionately about, that we need to be prepared for. That you talk about flipped classrooms. I know some people are real big fans of flipped classrooms, where you're talking about actually watching a video. And again, that is a big user of bandwidth. So those are just a few of the items that were left out and cut back from the original discussion and proposal about our technology plan.
It actually is in the documentation that you have. There's a paragraph there that says, in that written document, and that'll actually be part of our of the superintendent's message, that actually says here's what's not in there in those areas. What's missing are the first two that I mentioned.
Right, and at the risk of getting poked with a sharp pencil by my colleague of seeing the lateness of the hour, just anyone who's, I can't imagine who, I do think there's something about things that relate to student achievement, student outcomes, measuring student learning, understanding student learning. I just think that this paragraph, when it gets fleshed out, explaining that set of impact, because I think that otherwise the plumbing stuff sounds so vague and abstract, and you're talking about like life cycles of computers sounds vague, but when you say, because we went from a 4-year to a 5-year replacement, teachers cannot run programs on those computers. And here are some examples of that we need to go back to 4 years, that restoration actually is important, that somehow making that connection, which I know this is like, it's so in process, but some of that stuff doesn't come out yet.
Right.
Okay. I know it's in your heads, it just doesn't come out yet.
May I make one quick comment, please, about the idea of student achievement, and we'll, say, what impact will this have on student achievement? What all of us need to do is to collectively define what we mean by achievement. And that notion of achievement is changing in the conversations. It's not about MCAS, it's not about content, it's not about memorizing historical facts. What it's about is becoming college and career ready. And there are definitions of what college and career ready look like and what those are. And they say quite specifically technology. And then there are areas where technology is implied in terms of global citizenship and such. So we have to, that's why it's a little bit harder to nail when we're asked, well, what's the impact on student achievement?
Ms. Stone.
For anybody who's worried about the hour, I'd just like to point out that when you and I started on the school committee, this was routine because the school committee meetings started much later, something we put to rest. Another thing that's changed for the better in the last several years. At the risk of extending this conversation longer, I would be very grateful if Mr. Stokes is willing to do so, to hear from him about the townside perspective on this and where you see this getting us and what you think is left to do.
How much time do we have?
Yeah.
Just for the record, this is about an hour past my bedtime, so if I start rambling, somebody just kick me.
Use the mic.
I'm sorry. Good evening. Kevin Stokes, Chief Information Officer. Let me see if I can replay that question back. Where does this leave us? I guess I would characterize it this way, and again, I want to put it in the context of a sort of a quasi-outsider, purely myopic tech person, relative to this conversation. To Dr. Lupini's point, for the last couple of years, myself and Scott Morris, we've been trying to really work together to drive a strategy and try to drive the technology use and all the good things that we hope to see out of it. The challenge has been, as the enrollment pressures that begat space issues, that begat other priorities, a lot of times you were fighting for, really what amounted to mind share. It's nobody's fault. It's just at the end of the day, big problems required a lot of attention and a lot of diversion among a lot of the folks in the room. So as you start to see other problems get addressed with funding, you start to slip behind very quickly. And, lo and behold, in the world, what's happened, obvious to everybody, the paradigm has shifted. We're not using technology for instruction anymore. We're relying upon technology to facilitate learning. We're at a point right now, and Ms. Dickoff hit it off, perfectly. This is all plumbing. Endpoints now, whether they're computers, gadgets, or whatever, that's part of the plumbing now. They don't do a whole lot by themselves. So the plumbing, the stuff that's in the walls, the stuff that gets us out to the internet, is all really just a base first step. So, in the context of the bridge budget, I think it's a great story. It's not getting us anything, and it's not in that context, sensitive to the fact that there's a lot of things that the Override Study Committee has to address, and there's a lot of big problems. So again, going back to that point, they're looking at new initiatives with a different, focus. So to that end, I think what we're doing now is very important to allow us to build a strategy going forward that's going to really allow us, I think, to leverage this and hopefully implement a strategic plan that achieves the outcomes, that achieves all the end goals that we all hope that will be there. So I don't know, in a roundabout way, I think there needs to be a little bit more specificity. We've got a couple more days, I think, to iron that out. I was at the committee meeting last night. It was quite interesting. It was a very interesting background for me to hear, but I think I have a pretty good perspective on where they're coming from in terms of the questions. And a lot of them are going to be outcome-oriented. A lot of them are going to be, what does this get us? And I think, we've got good answers. I think we've got all the right context in terms of, what we're trying to achieve. And absolutely, I have all the respect in the world for the big problems that committee is trying to address right now. So in that context, we have to be very practical and I think modest in, what our aims are relative to the bridge budget, if that answers the question. Thank you.
Mr. Stokes, before you go away, I am one person who knew that you spent a lot of time last night at that hearing, and you've spent a lot of time tonight here, and you've also spent quality time, I know, with Dr. Lupini, because he's talked about it, and I just want to thank you very much for spending that time and focusing on what we're worried about.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lupini.
You're welcome, sir.
And is there anybody who has any new business? Seeing none, I will declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you.